Hey there, and welcome back. Whether you're joining us for the first time tonight, or you've been here with us before, I'm really glad you're here. I'm Mr. Dantello, and what we've gathered for you tonight is a collection of stories centered around ghosts and haunted places. Those spaces that seem to carry something with them, something that doesn't quite behave the way it should. We've got 4 stories for you tonight. First, there's the basement stories that lead down longer every night. A tale about the staircase that seems to have its own ideas about depth. Then we move into I keep finding my old house inside the inherited walls, which explores what happens when a space holds on to memories that aren't quite yours. Our third story is called The Guest Bedroom Door That Opens to Someone Else's Morning, a story about a door that opens onto something it shouldn't. And we'll finish the evening with the attic corner where yesterday's dust never settles, which asks what happens when time doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to in one small space. If you've been enjoying these stories, please do like and subscribe. It helps us keep this channel going, and it means the world to us. Now, get yourself comfortable wherever you are. Make sure you've got your space set up the way you like it. Dim the lights, settle in, maybe get yourself a blanket. This is your time to wind down. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Now, let's begin with our first story. Story 1. The basement stairs that lead down longer every night. I've been counting the stairs for 3 weeks now, and I haven't mentioned it to anyone because it sounds like the kind of thing people don't understand until they've experienced it themselves. Most people don't count stairs at all. They just descend them, their minds elsewhere, thinking about coffee or bills or what they'll eat for lunch. But I count them. I've always counted them. It's a small thing, unremarkable, the kind of habit you don't question because it doesn't hurt anyone. The house sits on Ashton Street, a Victorian built in 1884 according to the deed I received along with the inheritance. 3 stories of brick and weathered shutters, with a wraparound porch that sags slightly on the east side. The previous owner, my Aunt Claire, whom I never met, whom no one in my family seemed to speak about, left it to me with almost no explanation. A lawyer's letter, a key, instructions to contact the estate manager if there were any questions. There weren't. I was 31, drowning in rent, and suddenly I had a house. The basement is where I always go first when I move somewhere new. It's not a conscious decision, really. It's the part of a place that tells you most about what came before. Cellars hold things. They hold cold and damp and the architectural decisions of people long dead. This one smelled like stone and electricity and something older beneath that, something like rust or old pennies. The single bulb hung from a frayed cord. 60 watts, maybe. It cast the concrete floor in a yellow-white that made the shadows in the corners seem deeper than they probably were. The foundation walls were stone, genuine stone. the kind that takes 200 years to stop sweating. I remember touching one during that first week, and it was cold the way ice is cold, the way things underground are cold, not ambient cold, but cold that comes from the earth's body itself. 14 steps. I counted them on a morning in late September, maybe 10 days after I moved in. I was being methodical about the house, documenting what I owned now, what needed work. The basement stairs were wooden, older than the rest of the house's interior, with a railing that had been painted over so many times you couldn't quite see the grain anymore. The steps were steep, the kind of steep that made you consider each footfall. I descended slowly that morning, testing each tread, counting 1, 2, 3. The banister was tacky beneath my palm. Paint gummed up from decades of hands and moisture and time. 4, 5, 6. I wasn't rushing. I remember the light from the basement window well, a narrow rectangular window at ground level that showed only the fence of the yard next door, a blur of gray boards. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, floor, concrete. The space opened up around me into that cold. Yellow dark, and I was at the bottom. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, listening to the house settle around me. Old houses are loud, even when they're quiet. They creak and pop and groan in ways that newer construction doesn't. This was a noise I would have to get used to. I made a note, mental note, because I didn't yet write these things down, that the basement had 14 steps. I didn't think about it again until I couldn't sleep. It was late October, nearly a month later. I'd been in the house for weeks by then, and I'd settled into a kind of rhythm with it. Wake, work from home in the upstairs study. Eat, wander the halls in that aimless way you do when a place is still new. Sleep, or try to. That night, I wasn't trying. I was lying in bed in the master bedroom, which had been Claire's room, which felt strange to say even to myself, and my mind was cycling through that specific insomnia that comes from too much caffeine and not enough purpose. It was 3 a.m, or close to it. The house was at that depth of silence where you become aware of your own heartbeat, your own breath. I was thinking about nothing in particular, or thinking about everything in particular. The way insomnia works. I got up, went downstairs, not with a plan, but with that weightless wandering you do in the middle of the night when sleep seems impossible and staying in bed feels worse than moving. I turned on the hallway light, then the kitchen light. The stairs down to the basement were dark. I hadn't installed a switch at the top yet, kept meaning to, so I flicked on the basement bulb from the kitchen's wall switch. An old arrangement. The bulb flickered once, then steadied. I don't remember deciding to count, but my foot was on the first step, and I was counting. 1, 2, 3. The stairs felt different at night. Not physically different, I know that sounds strange, but different in the way they registered. Each step was distinct. Counted, conscious, 4, 5, 6. The air was cooler down here, or it felt cooler. The silence was thicker. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then I stopped. Not because I'd reached the bottom, because I'd counted 12, and I was still on the stairs. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the banister, 1 foot on the 12th step. The concrete floor was visible below me, yes, but it wasn't close. I was still maybe 4 or 5 feet above it. The light from the basement bulb caught the edge of the floor, the way the stairs ended, the way the space opened up. 13, 14, 15, 16, I was at the bottom. The concrete was cold through my socks. I stood in the basement, my heart doing something it shouldn't have been doing at 3 in the morning, loud and quick and unreasonable. The steps I'd just descended had been more than 14. Not many more, but more. 6 steps more. I counted them again, going back up. The numbers were consistent, 16 going up. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the kitchen as the night gradually became morning, and I didn't count. By the time the sun was up, I'd convinced myself I'd miscounted the first time. This happens. People miscount. You're tired, or you're not paying attention, or you've never counted in the first place, so you have no baseline for accuracy. 14 steps or 16 steps, it was the difference of 2 footfalls. Nothing. It was nothing. The basement had always had 16 steps. I'd simply been wrong in September, or I'd forgotten, or I'd counted poorly. I didn't go down again for several days. But I started to notice other things about the house. Small things. The way certain doors seemed to close more slowly than they should. The way the hallway felt longer when you walked it at a particular time of day. The way the light fell differently in rooms depending on what exactly? I wasn't sure. These were the kinds of observations that sound insane when spoken aloud, which is why I didn't speak them aloud. In the second week of November, I went to the attic looking for anything of Claire's that might tell me about her, about what kind of woman leaves a house to a relative she's never met without so much as a letter. The attic was a triangle of space, high-peaked and narrow, with floorboards that sang under my weight. There were boxes, plastic storage containers stacked against the far wall, and in the corner nearest the pull-down ladder, a set of blueprints, rolled and rubber-banded and labeled with a date, 1972. The paper was yellowed, brittle. I unrolled it on the attic floor, kneeling to pin it down at the corners with whatever was nearby, a book from the boxes, a shoe, my hand. The blueprints were detailed, the foundation, the walls, the electrical work, and clearly marked in the basement section the stairs. They were labeled, 12 steps total. I read it 3 times to make sure I was reading it correctly. 12, that's what the blueprint said. 12 steps from the basement door to the basement floor, with a landing halfway down and then 6 steps on the second section. Or was it different? Let me look again. 6 on the first section, 6 on the second. Or 7 and 5. The blueprints were precise, but also somehow ambiguous in that way old architectural drawings could be. What I knew with certainty was that someone, the architect, the builder, someone in 1884 or whenever these had been updated, had designed this basement with a specific number of steps. 12, according to the paper, not 14, not 16. I rolled the blueprints back up carefully, as if they might crumble if I wasn't gentle. My hands were shaking a little. I realized I was holding my breath. I let it out slowly. There was a rational explanation. Of course there was. The blueprints were old. Houses settled. Foundations shifted. Maybe the stairs had been replaced at some point. Maybe someone had added steps or removed them. This was what old houses did. They changed. Subtly, over time. They became different versions of themselves. Except I'd lived in old houses before, and I'd never experienced that. And the stairs didn't look replaced. They looked original, or at least as original as anything in a house this age could look. I left the attic and didn't go back. But I did go to the basement again the following night, not because I wanted to, because I needed to. Because there's a particular kind of curiosity that doesn't give you a choice. It's the curiosity of needing to understand a thing that doesn't make sense. It's the curiosity that makes people walk into dark spaces. It's the curiosity that keeps you awake. I turned on the light from the kitchen. I stood at the top of the stairs. I began to count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 18 steps that night. I was certain of it. I counted slowly, deliberately, 1 foot in front of the other. I counted up and then back down, and the number held. 18 in both directions. The basement floor was there when I reached it, solid and concrete and cold, exactly as it should be. But I'd descended 18 steps to get there, and the blueprints had said 12. This was the night something shifted in my understanding of the house. This was the night I stopped assuming I was wrong. The house I was beginning to understand was either lying to me or I was lying to myself, and I didn't yet know which would be worse. I stopped counting after that night. It felt like inviting something into my awareness that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. The count could vary, I told myself. I could be miscounting. I could be tired. I could be standing on the steps wrong, my measurements of space becoming unreliable in the dim yellow light that the basement fixture cast. But I didn't stop going down. It was something about the basement itself. It pulled at me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The air down there was different, not cold exactly, but heavy. Textured, it smelled like concrete and something else, something that reminded me of old paper and dust and the particular mustiness of places that rarely saw the sun. There was a workbench along one wall left behind by whoever had owned the house before me. On it sat a collection of tools so old and coated in rust that they looked like archaeological artifacts. Nails and mason jars, screws sorted by size, a manual egg beater, a pair of pliers with a wooden handle worn dark from decades of use. I never touched any of it, but I found myself spending time down there anyway, moving between the workbench and the shelving unit opposite it, which held boxes that I hadn't opened. They were labeled in handwriting so faded the ink had gone nearly colorless. I could make out fragments, spring 1978. Knitting books, do not donate. It was a few weeks after the stair counting that I first heard the sound. I was at the workbench, moving the egg beater slightly to the left, then back to the right, not sure why. Rearranging things that weren't mine. in a space that didn't quite feel like it belonged to me. The light hummed overhead, a sound I usually didn't notice but suddenly did. Outside the small basement window, which looked out at ground level onto the overgrown garden, I could hear the wind moving through the weeds, and beneath that, from somewhere deeper in the basement, a sound like something shifting. Not loudly, not sharply, just a slow, deliberate slide, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. I turned around. The basement is not large. I could see from the stairs to the far wall in the single sweep of my eyes. Nothing had moved. Nothing looked disturbed. There was the water heater humming its steady drone. There were the boxes, the shelving, the cold, empty space. But the sound came again, that same careful sliding, and I realized it was coming from behind the water heater, in the narrow space between it and the wall. My chest went tight. I didn't move. I told myself it was the house settling, the foundation shifting, a pipe expanding in the heat, all the things old houses do, all the sounds they make. But the sliding came again, and this time it sounded almost deliberate, intentional, like something was responding to my presence by moving. I climbed the stairs, all 18 of them. I counted without meaning to. The next morning I made coffee and told myself I hadn't heard anything unusual. The house was old. Houses made sounds. I'd lived here for 3 months now, which wasn't very long, and I was still attuning myself to its rhythms, its particular vocabulary of creaks and groans. That was all this was. That was all any of it was. But I found myself keeping a notebook by the bed anyway. Dated entries. Things I'd noticed. October 17th, heard sliding sound in basement. Came from behind water heater, likely pipes or foundation settling. October 21st, mail missing from the hall table. The 2 catalogs I'd set there in the morning were gone by evening. Checked basement, kitchen, bedroom, not found. Did I move them myself and forget? October 24th, stair count today was 16, down and up. Consistent, down and up, both 16. Confused about previous count of 18. Kitchen light was on when I woke. I know I didn't turn it on. I always turn it off before bed. But it was on. I read my own handwriting back to me, and it sounded like the observations of someone unraveling, someone grasping at explanations. But I kept writing, because documenting things made them feel manageable, made them feel like they were part of a pattern I could eventually understand. The house seemed to like the attention. That's when the small things started accumulating. A picture frame in the living room, there was only one, containing a photo of the house from the 1950s, posing for the camera in better condition, in the sun, was turned backward on the mantel. Just turned around. The glass facing the wall, the back of the frame showing. I turned it back. The next morning, it was turned around again. The cabinet door in the kitchen that stuck, the one I'd learned to push carefully with the heel of my hand because the hinges were old and wouldn't respond to ordinary opening, that door began opening on its own. Not slamming, just standing ajar, as if someone had been in it recently and hadn't bothered to close it properly. The basement light would be on when I came downstairs, even though I was certain I'd turned it off the night before. The switch had a particular gesture to it. You had to flip it up sharply and wait for the click. You had to be deliberate. It wasn't the kind of switch that could accidentally be left on. I kept the notebook updated. I told myself I was being observant. A good homeowner, noting what needed attention. But in the margins and in the spaces between entries, I was writing smaller things. Fragments. Why does time feel different downstairs? How well did I count that night? Does the kitchen light have a timer I don't know about? I was in the basement again on November 2nd, and this time I deliberately counted the stairs. I did it carefully, slowly, one step at a time. One Mississippi between each step, trying to account for any variation in my movement or attention. 13 steps down. 13 steps up. The next night, 19 down. 17 up. I stopped trying to maintain the pretense that this was normal. I started trying to find the pattern. Was the count dependent on the time of day? The light? Whether I counted out loud or in my head? I conducted experiments, each one a small act of acknowledgement that something was genuinely wrong. 12, 15, 14, 16, 13, 18, the numbers never repeated. There was no consistency, there was only variation, and the variation seemed almost random, except random doesn't feel designed, doesn't feel like it has intention behind it. I started sleeping less. Not from insomnia exactly, from something more like dread. I'd lie in bed listening to the house and trying to remember what normal sounds like. The radiators clanked and hissed as they heated and cooled, and I'd jot down the time and try to understand if the pattern was regular or if I was imagining consistency where there was only chaos. The kitchen light came on 3 nights in a row. On the 4th night I left it on deliberately to see if the pattern would break or reverse. It stayed on all through the next day. I came downstairs to morning light that felt oddly artificial, and I stood in front of the switch and stared at it, trying to figure out what statement the house was making. I turned it off at noon. I went to bed early. I left every other light in the house on. The next morning, only the basement light was burning. Every other light had been carefully switched off. There was intelligence in that choice. There was intention. There was something in this house that knew I was paying attention to it, and it was paying attention back. I called a contractor on November 7th. I told him I was concerned about the foundation, that I wanted to have the basement inspected. He came out on a cold afternoon, clipboard in hand, and I watched him descend the stairs while I stood at the top, unable to bring myself to go down behind him. He was down there for maybe 5 minutes. When he came back up, he had a small, confused smile on his face. "Basement looks fine," he said. "Foundation solid. No settling that I can see, no cracks in the concrete. You've got yourself a good, sturdy house here, probably built for 100 years of life left in it." He didn't mention the stairs. I didn't ask. But I watched him count on the way down. I know I did. He went down deliberately, 1 step at a time, maybe 5 or 6 steps before he moved out of sight. When he came back up, he didn't count. He just climbed. I paid him for the service and thanked him and didn't tell him that I counted 11 steps on his descent and 12 on his way back up. which meant either he'd started from a different place on the second journey, or the stairs had changed while he was standing on them in the dark. The real trouble started 2 days later. I was in the kitchen making dinner, pasta, something simple, and I became aware that the basement light was on again. But more than that, the door to the basement was open, and there was a smell coming up from down there that I hadn't encountered before. Not unpleasant exactly, but unfamiliar. It was like the smell of a room that hadn't been aired out in a very long time. Like the smell of something kept closed, deliberately kept closed. I turned off the stove. I approached the open basement door. The light was definitely on. I could see the glow spilling out onto the kitchen tiles, creating a small square of yellow that seemed too bright, too deliberate. I stood at the threshold and listened. For the first time, I heard something other than silence down there. It was subtle, a sound like cloth moving, a sound like breathing, almost the slow, steady respiration of something very large, taking in air. "Hello?" I said it quietly, testing the sound of my own voice in the house. The breathing sound stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something else. A sound like footsteps, not on the stairs, underneath them. A slow, deliberate pacing back and forth beneath the staircase itself, in whatever small dark space existed there. I pushed the door closed. I locked it. And I stood in my kitchen with my hands shaking, looking at the deadbolt on a basement door that I'd never known was meant to be locked, because the deadbolt had been installed on the inside. Installed by someone who wanted to keep something from coming up, or perhaps wanted to keep themselves from going down. That night, I found the blueprints again. I unrolled them on the kitchen table, and I began to see things I'd missed before, details obscured by age or the way the paper curled. In the corner of the basement section, in the tiniest handwriting, someone had made notations, dates and numbers, a count, one that went much higher than any stairs I'd ever seen. The earliest date was 1962. The number beside it was 47. By 1978, the year of the boxes marked knitting. Books, do not donate, the number had grown to 62. The last date on the blueprint was 1984. The number was 71. I studied that final entry for a long time. Then I went to the basement door and put my ear against it. In the darkness below, I heard nothing, which somehow felt worse than if I'd heard something at all. I didn't open that door for 3 days. But I knew, with a certainty that lived in my bones now, that I would open it eventually, because the house had shown me the blueprint for a reason, and the number wasn't done growing. On the 4th day, I stopped pretending I had a choice. I'd spent the morning trying to work, trying to answer emails, trying to exist in the normal architecture of my life, job, house, bills, the small duties that hold a person upright. But the house had a different rhythm now, and I was beginning to move in time with it rather than against it. The basement door remained locked. I'd checked it obsessively through the night, touching the deadbolt in the dark, confirming it was still engaged. Each time I found it was, I experienced a relief so acute it was nearly nauseating. The relief of something contained. the relief of a barrier still holding, but I could feel it wearing down. Not the lock, something else. The fabric of ordinary things, the way I used to understand my own home. On the fourth morning, I noticed that the pantry door, which faced the basement door across the kitchen, had begun to swell. Not dramatically, just enough that it no longer closed completely. Just enough that I could see a sliver of darkness inside when the kitchen light was on. I'd never noticed this before, though I'd lived here for nearly 2 years. I stood in front of it, considering how a door could change shape, how wood remembers moisture, how a house breathes differently than a person does, expanding and contracting on its own schedule, according to its own needs. I went to the living room and pulled out the blueprints again. I'd begun leaving them unrolled on the coffee table. There was something calming about seeing them spread out, seeing the lines and notations in the daylight, as if understanding the architecture meant understanding what was happening. The basement section was drawn with unusual detail for such a structure. Most basements were afterthoughts in these old houses, simple rectangles, the negative space beneath the living rooms above. But this one had been subdivided. There were walls within walls, small chambers, dead ends. The kind of compartmentalization that suggested someone had been trying to divide the space into something more than a basement, something more like a collection of rooms. I traced the notations again. 1962, 47, 1978, 62, 1984, 71, numbers climbing like the days were climbing, like time itself was accumulating in the dark below my feet. By late afternoon, I'd made a decision. I'd made several decisions, actually, over the past 4 days to call someone, to move, to simply ignore it all. But they were fragile decisions, the kind that crumbled the moment I tried to act on them. This decision felt different. This one felt chosen by something larger than my own will. I would go down. Not tonight. Tonight I would prepare. Tonight I would accept that this was going to happen, and I would gather what I might need, though I couldn't articulate what that might be. A light, something to defend myself with, though against what, I didn't know. Clarity, maybe, an answer. I found a heavy flashlight in the garage and tested it. The beam was strong, cutting through the gathering dusk of the garage with a yellow intensity that seemed to hold back the shadows like a physical thing. I found a hammer, a knife from the kitchen. These felt absurd even as I collected them, the props of someone playing at courage rather than experiencing it. And then, as the evening pressed in and the house began its slow settling into darkness, I heard something that made the decision for me. A sound from the basement. Not the breathing or the rustling or the pacing, something else. Something that sounded almost like a door opening, followed by, and this was what made my hands go cold, the sound of footsteps on the basement stairs. Ascending, I was in the kitchen. I could hear it with absolute clarity, even through the locked basement door. The slow, deliberate placement of feet on each step. Not hurrying, not angry, just climbing, one step at a time. Methodical, patient, I counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, whoever or whatever was descending. No, ascending was taking a longer route than the stairs I'd climbed, longer than the 11 and 12 I'd counted before. 4, 5, 6, 7, the sound continued. The placement of weight, the shift of a body moving upward through the dark. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my hand on the deadbolt, knowing absolutely that I should not turn it, that the lock was the only thing between the kitchen where I stood and whatever was coming up. 8, 9, 10, the footsteps stopped. I held my breath. In the silence, I could hear the old house settling around me, the small creaks and adjustments of wood and plaster, the sound of a place existing in time, carrying its own weight. Then I heard something that unmade me in a way nothing else had managed to do. I heard the sound of something stopping at the top of the stairs, stopping just on the other side of the basement door. And I heard the sound of the deadbolt, the lock that existed on the inside of the basement door, slowly turning. Not clicking. Turning like a hand was on the other side, gripping the mechanism and rotating it with intention. The lock came free. I watched it happen. I couldn't look away from it. The deadbolt, which had been engaged, which had been my barrier, slowly rotating from locked to open. It stopped when it was fully disengaged. The door remained closed. But it was no longer locked. No, I said. It came out as barely a whisper. No, the house was silent again, the way it had been silent for days, except now the silence held a different quality. Now the silence felt like something anticipating, like the held breath before a question is answered. I moved. I don't remember deciding to move, but suddenly I was in motion, grabbing the flashlight and the hammer, moving away from the basement door. I went to the hallway. I kept going. Up the stairs to the second floor, then higher to the attic access. The ladder pulled down creaking. I climbed it without thinking, pulling myself up into the attic space where the air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood, and I sat there in the dark, my flashlight beam cutting through the accumulated shadows of decades. Below me, I could hear the basement door opening. The sound it made was quiet, thoughtful, like something finally being allowed to emerge after a very long time. I heard footsteps in the kitchen, slow, measured, moving through the space I'd occupied not 3 minutes before. I heard the sound of something breathing in the house, not the wind, not the settling of the structure, but actual respiration. Audible, present, the footsteps moved through the hallway. They reached the bottom of the stairs to the second floor. And then they started to climb. 1 step. 2, 3. I sat in the attic, my hammer useless, my flashlight beam shaking, counting the steps in a voice I no longer recognized as my own, because I was beginning to understand something that made the earlier realization feel like child's play. The steps were taking longer to climb the second staircase than they had the first. It was as if the act of ascending was stretching the space itself, as if each level of the house was deeper than the one below it, as if the house itself was larger on the inside than it had any right to be. And what had been climbing up from the basement was learning how to navigate that impossible geometry. I reached the door to the attic and locked it from the inside. There was no lock on this door. I'd never noticed that before. There had never been a need. The footsteps reached the second floor. They moved through the hallway above the kitchen. They moved past the bedrooms. They were moving toward the attic stairs with a certainty that suggested they knew exactly where they were going. Outside, night had fully fallen. Through the small attic window, I could see nothing but darkness and my own pale reflection in the glass. The footsteps stopped below me. I heard the creak of the hallway floor, and then I heard the attic ladder being pulled down with deliberate care. The climb began, 1, 2, 3 longer every step, stretching, extending, the space between each step growing as the figure ascended, as if the house was allowing more and more distance to exist between the ground floor and wherever it was that this thing was going. I raised the hammer, though the gesture was theater and we both knew it. The ladder groaned under the weight of the ascent, and I finally understood what the numbers on the blueprint meant. They weren't a count of stairs. They were a count of something else entirely, and the number, I was certain now, had not been finished in 1984. The ladder bent under the weight of the approaching presence, bowed inward as if something very heavy was climbing it with a terrible, patient intention. And I realized, in the moment before the first shadow appeared at the top of the ladder's passage, that I would be counting too. I would be the next number. The descent, no, the ascent, was finally complete. I don't remember the climb. That's the thing that bothers me most about it now, weeks later. The thing that keeps me awake in the apartment I've rented downtown, the one with fluorescent locks and neighbors on both sides, and the overhead hum of other people's lives pressing down like a weight. I remember the shadow at the top of the ladder. I remember the attic suddenly feeling very small, the air too thick to breathe. I remember raising the hammer as if it meant anything at all. And then there's nothing. A gap. A space in my memory like a tooth pulled out of a jaw, leaving only the hollow of where it was. I woke on the attic floor. Daylight was coming through the small window. My watch said 7:43 am. The hammer was beside me. Untouched, my hands were not shaking. This, more than anything else, frightened me. That I should feel this calm after what I was certain had happened, even though I couldn't remember it happening. The attic ladder was folded neatly into the ceiling. The access door was closed. There was nothing disturbed in that space, nothing out of place. If I had not known better, I would have believed I'd simply fallen asleep after climbing up to take measurements. But I knew better. I went downstairs carefully, as if the house might fracture under my weight. The blueprint was still on the kitchen counter, rolled exactly as I'd left it. The pencil I'd used to mark the numbers lay parallel to its edge. Everything was in order. Everything was exactly as it should be. I called the realtor that afternoon. I told her I decided not to buy the house. She asked why, and I found myself unable to articulate it. Unable to describe the way the air felt in the basement, or how the stairs seemed to exist in a slightly different relationship to the rest of the structure. or the fact that a blueprint from decades ago contained numbers that continued down to depths that the blueprints from more recent inspections could not quite explain. "Is there something wrong with the property?" she asked. "No," I said, and it was almost the truth. "It's just not what I'm looking for." By the next week, I'd stopped thinking about it actively. The mind is merciful that way. It handles trauma the way the ocean handles garbage. It sinks it, displaces it, lets the weight of everything else press it down until it's no longer visible from the surface. I found a different apartment, signed a lease, bought furniture, made the space feel inhabited. For a while, it worked. I could go entire days without thinking about the house on Blackwell Street. But something had changed in me. Some internal compass had been adjusted. It started with the hallways. The hallway in my apartment building, a perfectly ordinary hallway, narrow and fluorescent lit and smelling of industrial cleaner, began to feel wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Not dangerous exactly, just inconsistent. I found myself counting the doors from the elevator to my unit. 13, but sometimes if I wasn't paying attention, I'd count and get 14. And then 13 again, as if the distance was shifting depending on whether I was thinking about it. I stopped using the stairs, took the elevator exclusively. The elevator is a closed space. The distance is fixed. Then it was the basement of my new building, a laundry room down there, and I avoided it. I found a laundromat 3 blocks away instead, and I went there weekly, and I never questioned why I preferred it, even though it meant walking in the rain and carrying wet clothes through the city. My therapist asked me why I developed these avoidance behaviors. I told her I was uncomfortable with enclosed spaces. She nodded and made notes and prescribed something to help me sleep. The medication worked. Mostly, it made the nights feel like they happened to someone else, distant and muffled. But even drug sleep isn't deep enough to escape certain things. I dreamed of counting. Numbers ascending in a voice that wasn't quite my own, though it used my mouth to speak them. Numbers that continued past where they should have, past where they had any reason to. And in the dream, I understood that they were connected, all of them, all the houses and apartments and buildings everywhere. That there were staircases inside structures all across the city, all descending longer than they had any right to. All of them extending downward into geometries that the waking mind couldn't quite accommodate. And something was still climbing. 3 months after leaving the house on Blackwell Street, I received a #additional middle section. The basement had a smell that no amount of opening windows upstairs could touch. It was cool and mineral, like the inside of a cave that had never seen sunlight, mixed with something older, something that reminded me of wet concrete and rust, and the particular mustiness of paper left in darkness for decades. When I descended those stairs each morning to check the count, I found myself breathing through my mouth by the 3rd step down. I began keeping a record. Not obsessively at first, just marks on a notebook I left on the kitchen counter, tallying the number of steps with clinical precision. 13 to 16, sometimes 17. Never fewer than 13. never more than 19. There was a range, but the range itself was what terrified me. A conscious variation, a choice. The walls around the staircase were unfinished concrete, painted a sickly institutional beige sometime in the 70s, I imagined. In certain light, and I'd taken to coming down at different times, morning, evening, the strange hollow hours around midnight. The paint looked almost alive. Not moving, nothing so obvious. But the way shadows pooled in the grain of it, the way moisture seemed to bloom and fade across its surface, there was something almost breathing about it. I'd run my hand along the rail once, early on. Wood worn smooth by decades of gripping hands, and so cold it surprised me, even though basements are always cold. It remained cold. Even on the one uncomfortably warm August night when the upstairs felt like an oven, I came downstairs and the rail was cold enough to make my palm ache. The basement itself was unfinished. Mostly, that's what the inspection report had said. Unfinished, a word that suggested potential, that some previous owner had simply never gotten around to the work. What it actually meant was exposed pipes running overhead like the ribs of something, concrete flooring that held water stains in patterns that almost formed shapes if you stared long enough, and a darkness that electric light couldn't quite defeat. I'd installed better lighting, brighter bulbs, but the corners remained resolute. The darkness there seemed to absorb illumination. Old houses have a particular quality when you're alone in them after dark. Every creak becomes a deliberation. Every settling groan becomes a presence. But there's something different about a basement, something that precedes the house itself. The house sits on top of it. The basement is what came first, what the house was built to contain. Standing at the bottom of those stairs, I sometimes felt like I was in the real structure, and the rooms above, the bedroom where I slept, the kitchen where I made coffee, were just the temporary surface. I'd taken to spending time down there, not for any practical reason, but because I needed to. The counting had become ritual. I would descend each morning at first light, before coffee, before anything else, my hand on the rail, feet finding each step without looking. A certain number, a new number. I would turn around at the bottom and look back up at the staircase, as if the steps might suddenly rearrange themselves in daylight. They never did when I was looking. There was a particular quality to the silence down there. Not the absence of sound, but a thickness to it. The kind of silence that has weight and texture. If the upstairs silence felt like emptiness, the basement silence felt like presence, something occupying the space that sound couldn't penetrate. It swallowed the hum of the furnace. It absorbed the small creaks of the house settling. Sometimes I'd stand perfectly still and try to listen into it, and the effort would make my ears ring. The concrete floor was marked with years of small damages, a dark stain near the far wall that I couldn't identify and didn't want to. A section by the utility sink that looked like old water damage. The concrete there almost granular, crumbling slightly at the edges. chips in the corners where furniture had been moved or dragged, the marks of previous occupation, evidence of lives lived in this space, storage, utility, the necessary ugliness that basements are designated to hold. I found myself cataloging these imperfections, a way of anchoring myself, perhaps, making the space knowable through inventory. The crack in the western wall that ran nearly floor to ceiling, narrower at the bottom, wider as it climbed. The spot near the stairs where someone had painted over a darker stain years ago. The paint thin enough that the mark showed through anyway. The corner where the previous owner had abandoned a child's toy, a wooden block, unpainted, unmarked. I'd left it there. Moving it felt like an acknowledgment. The air temperature shifted as you moved through the space. At the bottom of the stairs, it was perhaps 55 degrees. Walking toward the far wall, it seemed to drop. The corner near the boiler was warmer, the only heat source down there, but also strangely stale, like the air had been circulating the same molecules of itself for years. My breath began to show as vapor if I stayed long enough, even in summer. My body had begun to respond to the place in ways I couldn't entirely control. My pulse would quicken on the descent, my throat would tighten, the small hairs on my arms would rise, sometimes without obvious cause. Cold-blooded animal fear, the kind of response that precedes conscious thought, the kind that exists for reasons that our reasoning minds can no longer quite remember. I'd stopped sleeping well, not because of nightmares or noise or anything so simple, just a pervasive wakefulness that followed me. I'd lie in bed upstairs, the bed in the room that should be the safest room, the bedroom, the sleeping space, and feel the basement beneath me. Not like a foundation beneath a house, like something I was lying on top of. Like the basement was the real thing, and I was the temporary covering. Tear, no return address. My name handwritten on the envelope in precise, careful script. Inside was a photograph. It was the blueprint. My photograph taken from where I'd left it on the kitchen counter. But the numbers had been extended. Someone had continued the count in the same pencil, the same hand in the margin running down the side of the page. The numbers went down to 47. And below that, in smaller writing, a note, "The measurement is not yet complete. There are still more floors beneath, more descents to account for. Yours are still waiting." I burned the photograph, threw the ashes down the toilet, but I kept the envelope. I still have it, actually, locked in a drawer in my desk. I don't know why I kept it. I don't know what I'm afraid will happen if I destroy it. If perhaps destroying it would trigger something, would draw attention where attention should not be drawn. The apartment I'm in now, I've lived in it for nearly a year. I don't use the stairs. I don't go into the basement. I don't count the hallway tiles or the doors in the corridor or the steps from my bed to my bathroom. I've trained myself not to pay attention to the measurements of things, not to look too closely at architecture, not to wonder about the spaces between the walls. Most days, I'm fine. Most days I can almost convince myself that the house on Blackwell Street was a stress-induced hallucination. that the blueprint numbers were a trick of my exhausted mind, that the sound I heard climbing was nothing more than the ordinary settling of an old structure. Most days I believe this, but every night, before I take the medication that will make me sleep, I lie in bed and listen to the sounds of the building around me, the hum of the pipes, the movement of people above me, the distant opening and closing of elevator doors. And underneath it all, so faint I might be imagining it, I hear something else, the sound of footsteps. In a stairwell somewhere in this building, climbing slowly, methodically, counting as they go, taking longer with each step to traverse the distance between floors, the space between one level and the next stretching to accommodate the weight of the ascent. The count is at 23 now. I know this because I hear it most nights, and I've begun to keep track. I don't want to. I've tried very hard not to. But there's something about the rhythm of it, the patient inevitability of it, that makes it impossible not to listen, impossible not to count along, and I find myself wondering, in the moments before sleep takes me, which number will be mine. When those footsteps finally reach this floor, finally find this door, finally begin the climb to whatever space exists above my ceiling, and there must be a space there, there's always a space there, isn't there? What number will I be in the count? I don't sleep well anymore, even with the medication, but at least in sleep I don't have to listen. At least in sleep, the counting stops. Story 2. I keep finding my old house inside the inherited walls. I measured the east wing hallway on a Tuesday in October, before the light went strange. This seems like a normal thing to say. I was measuring because I had inherited the house 3 months prior, and I wanted to understand it before I hired anyone to work on it. A Victorian mansion in a town I'd moved away from at 18, a place my mother had mentioned only rarely, always in a tone that suggested she'd prefer not to. When the letter arrived from the estate attorney, I almost thought it was a mistake. But I'd inherited it. It was mine now. And so I was measuring. The tape measure was a professional one, 25 meters rubber grip, the kind that feels substantial in your hand. I'd borrowed it from my neighbor, who was friendly in the way neighbors are when you're a stranger in a town where everyone else grew up. I'd started in the morning on the ground floor, where dust motes hung in the amber light coming through bay windows. The front room measured 14 feet by 18 feet, which aligned with what I could see from outside. The parlor beside it was 12 by 16. Nothing remarkable. The mathematics of the house made sense. Then I started on the east wing. It's easy to describe the physical appearance of a Victorian mansion. High ceilings, these were at least 10 feet. Wainscoting that ran halfway up the walls painted a deep sage that had probably been fashionable in 1987, but had aged into something that looked deliberately mournful. Crown molding that collected dust in its recesses. The hallway itself stretched longer than seemed logical for the exterior footprint, but that's not unusual in old houses. They're often built in stages. Additions make sense of nothing. What I remember most clearly is the wallpaper. It was a repeating pattern, small, intricate, easy to ignore if you weren't looking for it. Cream background with thin lines of green and rust that formed geometric shapes. Almost Victorian in intent, though probably from sometime in the 1970s based on the quality of the print. It was peeling in places near the ceiling, and in one corner someone had started to strip it away, leaving only the ghost outline of adhesive and a few stubborn curls that had hardened like dried skin. I remember thinking I'd have to replace it all. I measured the hallway proper first, the space from the south wall to the north wall at the midpoint. 14 feet. That seemed right. Then I turned and measured the length, starting from where the hallway began at the main intersection, and extending it north toward what should have been the exterior wall based on the house's footprint. 38 feet. I wrote that down in the small notebook I'd been using. The pencil was one I'd found in a drawer downstairs, worn down to a nub, the eraser completely gone. I wrote 38 in neat print and moved to take a measurement from the opposite direction just to confirm. 38 feet again. That's when I stepped back and really looked at the hallway as a whole. The light coming through the high windows at the south end, I could see exactly where the exterior wall should have been because of the way the sun hit. A sight line. A reference point. The thing is, 38 feet extended past that point by a good 7 feet. I measured again. 38 feet. The exterior wall of the house, measured from the ground, showed only about 28 feet of width for the entire east wing. I know this because I'd walked around the house that morning, measuring it cold, from the outside in. I'd stood in the overgrown garden and sighted along the roofline and counted windows. 38 feet inside, 28 feet outside. A difference that shouldn't have existed, unless the walls themselves were 3 feet thick, which they weren't. I'd seen the cross-section where the plaster was chipped near the baseboard. I stood in that hallway for a long time that Tuesday afternoon, holding the tape measure, doing the arithmetic again. It didn't correct itself. I told myself it was the way Victorian houses were built. They settled. They shifted. The walls bowed in ways that weren't visible to the eye. Or I'd measured wrong. Or my exterior measurement had been off. I'd been standing in an overgrown yard with grass up to my knees. And measurement is not always intuitive when you're working at angles. I decided to move on. The first door off the hallway opened to what I assumed was a study, or perhaps a bedroom. The previous owners had left almost nothing behind except a few pieces of furniture too large or too damaged to move. A dresser with one leg shorter than the others, a wooden chair with the seat worn through to the frame. The room itself was rectangular, with good proportions, and a fireplace that had been boarded up with particle board at some point. I measured it. 12 feet by 15 feet. That made sense until I tried to reconcile it with the hallway's depth and the width of the walls themselves. And then it made slightly less sense than before, but only slightly. I was beginning to wonder if I was being sloppy with my work. The second door opened to a smaller space, a bathroom, though the fixtures had long since been removed. The room was narrow, barely wide enough for a standard tub, 4 feet by 8 feet. The tile on the floor was original, I thought. Little hexagons in a dull beige with hints of pink that I recognized from photographs of 1920s bathrooms. This room was where I first felt the wrongness settle into my chest. I don't have a good explanation for it. There was nothing visually strange about the bathroom itself. It was empty. Ordinary, the light from the hallway spilled in through the open door and illuminated dust and a faint watermark on the far wall, where something had leaked long ago. But as I stood measuring, I felt the space contract, or felt myself become too large for it, an awareness of walls that seemed closer than they should have been, of a depth that didn't quite match the distance I'd just walked through the hallway. The air in there was colder, not dramatically so, only by a degree or two, I think, but noticeable, the kind of cold that makes you aware that you have skin. I finished the measurement quickly and stepped back into the hallway, and the feeling released me. I told myself it was the October weather working its way through the old pipes beneath the house. It was old construction and poor insulation. It was reasonable for one room to be colder than another. I'd grown up in houses with basements in the Midwest. I understood drafts. I understood how temperature moved through old buildings like something living. Still, I didn't go back into the bathroom that day. I moved past the third door instead, which was locked. The key wasn't in any of the obvious places, not hanging on a hook by the entrance, not in the desk drawers downstairs, not in the mason jar of miscellaneous keys that sat on the shelf above the kitchen sink. I made a note of it. Locked door, east wing, third position down the hallway. Would need to investigate. The fourth door opened to a much larger space. A bedroom, definitely, with a fireplace that was open and functional. The walls were bare plaster where the wallpaper had been removed, and the room had a quality of waiting to it. The kind of room that felt temporary even though it had probably stood in that state for years. I measured it. 22 feet by 18 feet. That seemed substantial, but not impossible. I was working my way along the hallway in a methodical fashion, and I was trying not to think about the bathroom cold or the impossible arithmetic of the hallway itself. I was trying to focus on collecting information, on being the kind of person who makes notes and measurements and draws sensible conclusions. It's easy to be that person until you can't be anymore. By the time I reached the fifth door, the one at what should have been the very end of the hallway, at the exterior wall, I'd filled 3 pages of my notebook with measurements that didn't add up. I could have added them differently. I could have convinced myself that I'd made an error. But I hadn't. I'm meticulous about that. My work requires precision. I'm an architect, or I was before I moved back to my hometown and decided that teaching high school geometry might be a better use of my remaining energy. The fifth door was wallpapered shut. That's the only way to describe it. Someone at some point had hung wallpaper over it, the same cream and rust and green pattern that covered the hallway walls. All of it done seamlessly. If you weren't looking carefully, you wouldn't see the outline of the frame beneath the paper. But it was there, a faint rectangular shadow beneath the surface. I stood looking at it for a long time. I pulled a small corner of the wallpaper away, just enough to confirm that there was a door frame underneath. Wood, what looked like the original finish, dark and worn. I could feel the edge of the frame with my fingertip. I let the wallpaper fall back into place. I didn't do any more measuring that day. I packed up my tools and drove into town and had dinner at a restaurant where the waitress knew me by name, which was strange and not comforting. She'd been 2 years ahead of me in high school. She asked how it felt to be back. I told her it felt like stepping into a photograph. That night, I lay in the temporary house I'd rented, a small cottage 3 blocks from the mansion, and I thought about the hallway. I thought about the measurements. I thought about the cold in the bathroom and the way the light had looked wrong by the time I'd finished, like it had shifted slightly on its axis without my noticing. I thought about my mother, who'd never spoken about the mansion and who'd died 6 months before the will was read. I thought about whether she'd ever lived in it. I thought about all of this, and I did not reach any conclusions. By Wednesday morning, I'd convinced myself that I'd made an error and that I should remeasure everything. This seemed like the rational thing to do. This seemed like something a reasonable person would do. I went back to the house early, when the light was clear and direct and there was no room for shadow interpretation. The measurements were the same. I measured the hallway 3 times. It was 38 feet every time. I measured it with the tape pulled tight, accounting for any slack. I measured it again with the north wall as my reference point. I walked the distance in steps. I calculated the rough length. Everything confirmed it. 38 feet. 28 feet. 10 feet of space that did not exist. I sat down on the floor of the hallway that morning, right in the middle of the cream-colored carpet that had been there when I'd first walked through the house, and I tried to understand what this meant. It was my first real moment of understanding that something was profoundly wrong with the space I'd inherited. Not wrong in the sense of poor repair or structural damage. Wrong in a way that undermined the basic principles of how a building should function. Wrong in a way that implied something more fundamental than old construction or poor planning. I sat there and I didn't touch the wallpaper door. I didn't try any of the other measurements again. I simply sat and let my mind work through possibilities, each one less satisfying than the last. Then I got up and went back downstairs and made coffee in the kitchen, and I tried not to think about the space above my head and what it might contain. I would be back, though. I would return to that hallway many times over the following weeks, and with each visit I would uncover something else, something that made less sense than the last thing, something that pulled me deeper into understanding that the house I'd inherited was not a house at all, or was not simply a house. It was something else, a container. A collector, a place that held things inside its walls that shouldn't have been able to fit. But I didn't know any of that yet, Not on that Wednesday morning when I sat on the floor and drank coffee that had gone cold while I wasn't paying attention, watching the wallpaper pattern repeat its small geometric shapes across the surface of a door I hadn't opened. Not yet. The first week passed in the methodical way inherited houses demand. There was paperwork. There were inspections I'd scheduled months prior, back when I thought I was simply inheriting property. The inspector came on a Thursday morning, a man named Drew who moved through the rooms with the practiced indifference of someone who had seen 100 old houses and found them all roughly equivalent in their various states of decline. He marked things on his clipboard: the original hardwood under the kitchen linoleum, the water stain in the master bedroom's southeast corner, the electrical outlets that predated any safety standard I recognized. He nodded at the plumbing, frowned at the roof, and told me I'd need new gutters before the next heavy rain. Everything standard. Everything expected. I didn't ask him about the hallway. I'm not sure why. I told myself it was because the spatial discrepancy could be explained by poor measurement on my part, by the natural settling of old foundations, by 100 mundane reasons that didn't require mentioning to a professional. But the truth was simpler and stranger. I didn't want him to measure it. I didn't want someone else to confirm what I'd already calculated. I wanted to sit with the wrongness privately, the way you might sit with a medical symptom before deciding whether to have it examined. After Drew left, I didn't go back to the hallway for 2 days. Instead, I worked on the kitchen. There was something comforting about destruction and renovation, the clear cause and effect of pulling down old wallpaper and revealing the plaster beneath. I'd never been a particularly handy person, but my grandfather had left the house to me partly because he'd trusted that I would preserve it, and that trust seemed to demand some physical effort on my part, even if the preservation was preceded by careful removal. The morning of the 3rd day I was standing on a step stool, working at a section of border that had begun to peel naturally with age. The kitchen smelled like vinegar and old glue. My fingernails were broken. There was dust in my hair that had been there since at least noon. I heard the sound from upstairs. It was a single noise, distinct and unmistakable. The sound of a door closing, not gently, not a drift or the settling of wood in changing temperature. A closure, deliberate and final. I stopped working. My hand remained raised, fingers still pulling at the paper. The house was silent. I live alone in it. I had locked the front and back doors. All the windows that hadn't been painted shut were closed against the October cold. I got down from the step stool carefully. The sound had come from the direction of the master bedroom, I thought, or possibly from the hallway beyond it. I moved through the kitchen into the foyer, then started up the stairs. My heartbeat had accelerated, though I knew there were explanations. Wind, the structural settling of an old house, which produces sounds that can seem directional but originate everywhere and nowhere. An animal in the attic space, I'd thought about that possibility, had considered calling someone to investigate. The master bedroom was empty. The door was open to the hallway. I walked through it and looked at the other doors along that stretch of corridor. The linen closet was closed. The bathroom was open. The guest bedroom at the far end was closed. None of them had been freshly closed. There was no air movement. The doors sat in their frames with the patient indifference of doors everywhere. I went back downstairs and continued pulling off wallpaper. But I listened more carefully after that. The house had been silent before the sound, and it was silent afterward. That kind of silence felt different now. It felt like attention. The next occurrence happened on a Saturday morning while I was in the basement. I'd been spending more time down there, drawn by the same impulse that had made me keep returning to the hallway. The basement was unfinished in that particular way of old houses, where the foundation shows and the ceiling is open to the joists above. It was cold and damp and furnished with the detritus of my grandfather's life, a workbench that still held his tools, cardboard boxes of receipts and documents, an old freezer that no longer functioned, sealed and waiting to be removed. The light came from a single bulb hanging from a cloth-covered cord. When the bulb would eventually burn out, I had no idea how I would replace it. There was a switch at the top of the stairs, but the basement felt like a place that existed outside normal domestic logic. I was standing at the workbench, looking through a box of receipts, trying to understand the geography of my grandfather's spending habits. Groceries from a store that had closed in the 90s. Gas from a station on a road that had been widened and rerouted. Medical visits to a doctor whose name I recognized vaguely from childhood. A tall man with gray hair who'd once examined me for an ear infection in my grandfather's house while my mother waited in the kitchen. The sound came from behind me, from the direction of the stairs. It was the sound of footsteps, clear, deliberate footsteps on the wooden stairs. The specific creak of the third step, I'd heard that creak myself 100 times. The softer sound of the fifth step, the seventh. Someone was coming down. I turned. The stairs were empty. The light from the basement bulb cast sharp shadows of the balusters on the wall. Nothing moved on those stairs. No one was descending, but I could still hear them. The ninth step creaked. The 11th. Not loud, but audible. The deliberate progress of someone moving with purpose from the first floor to the basement level. I watched the empty stairs. My hands had become very still. I could feel my own pulse in my neck. The sound of footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs where the concrete floor began. The final creak was the lower landing, a small platform where the last step deposited you before the basement proper. For a moment there was only silence. Then I heard the slow drag of something across the concrete, something heavy, pulled rather than carried. It moved across the floor, away from the stairs, into the far corner where my grandfather had kept the old freezer. I didn't move. My breath had become shallow. I was aware of being alone and aware of being, simultaneously, not alone. The dragging sound stopped. Nothing else happened. No further sounds emerged from the shadows at the far end of the basement. The air didn't move. The house settled into its previous quiet, with the ease of something returning to a comfortable position. After several minutes, I went back upstairs. I locked the basement door, something I'd never done before, and didn't return to it for a week. The rational explanations presented themselves readily, the way they always do. Old houses are full of sounds. Foundations shift. Pipes carry noise through unexpected channels. There are animals in walls. Wind moves through spaces designed to move air. And sometimes your own expectation of strangeness manufactures it, your brain filling gaps in perception with the shapes of things you're prepared to fear. I knew this. I'd spent enough time on internet forums about old houses to understand the physics of creaks and the psychology of isolated living. I told myself these things while I made coffee and cleaned the kitchen and tried to focus on practical matters. But my attention had shifted. The house was no longer background. It had become a presence. I found myself taking mental notes. The times when rooms felt colder than the ambient temperature should allow. The way the master bedroom seemed to recede slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it. A trick of perspective or architecture, surely, but worth cataloging. The smell that appeared in the second-floor hallway some afternoons, not unpleasant, but present. Faint, like flowers that had dried long ago, and were now releasing their memory rather than their perfume. I began opening the wallpaper door, not fully, just enough to see past the frame. Behind it was what I expected, the blank end of the hallway where it terminated and did not continue. A wall papered in the same cream pattern, clean and undisturbed. The door itself was ordinary, wood painted white. A simple brass handle. It opened smoothly, without creaking. Each time I opened it, I found nothing different. Each time the hallway ended where my measurement said it should not end. But I kept opening it. Every day, usually in the morning before I'd fully woken up and could talk myself out of it. Every time it was the same. A wall, a door, a space that was completely, emphatically wrong. Then one morning I opened it, and something was different. It was subtle, the kind of thing I might have imagined. But as I stood in that hallway, holding the door open with my hand, I was certain that the light from the bedroom window at the far end was falling differently on the back wall. The shadow cast by the wallpaper pattern seemed to fall at an angle that didn't match the direction of the sun. More than that, there was a smell, faint but present, that old flower smell, but stronger now, and underneath it, something else. Something like the particular cold that comes from a room that has been closed for a very long time. I closed the door slowly. I looked at it. I went back to my room and sat on the bed and tried to convince myself that I had been mistaken about the light. That night, I heard footsteps in the hallway for the first time. Not from the stairs this time. In the hallway itself, moving with slow deliberation past my bedroom door. Back and forth, twice, back and forth, as if someone were pacing, as if someone were waiting for something, or as if they were looking for someone. I didn't open my door. I lay in bed and I listened, and I tried to decide whether I was losing hold of rational explanation or whether this house was actually pulling me deeper into something I didn't yet understand. By morning, I knew I would need to go back to the hallway, and this time I would need to do more than measure the walls. This time, I would need to understand what the space beyond that door was attempting to become. The door was no longer difficult to open. That's what I noticed first, not the most important thing, perhaps, but the thing that unsettled me most. Before, the hinges had required pressure, the kind of resistance that old wood gives when it hasn't been used in years. Now it swung at the lightest touch, smooth as if someone had recently oiled it. I hadn't oiled it. I opened it fully this time and stepped into the hallway. It was early morning, that particular quality of light that comes before the day has committed to itself. The house around me was quiet in the way it had learned to be quiet, not the silence of an empty space, but the silence of something that is listening. The back wall was still there. The hallway still ended where it shouldn't. But as I approached it, I saw what I had missed the previous morning. There were marks on the wallpaper. Faint, as if someone had dragged their fingertips across the cream-colored surface, tracing the floral pattern. The marks were recent. The wallpaper where the fingers had touched showed a slightly different sheen, as though the dust had been disturbed only hours before. I touched the same spot. The wallpaper was cool beneath my palm, cooler than the rest of the hallway, and as my hand rested there, I felt something I can only describe as a presence on the other side of the wall. Not a sound, not a movement, a weight, a pressure against the cream-colored paper as if something were leaning there, waiting for me to turn away. I turned away. I went to the kitchen and made coffee and told myself that a house shifts. Wood swells and contracts. The senses, when isolated and attentive, begin to perceive meaning in randomness. I had read about this. The mind creates patterns when it is afraid. Fear is a storyteller, and I had been living in a story that was beginning to consume all other explanations. But I knew, even as I told myself these things, that I was lying. The footsteps returned that night, but this time they were not alone. I was reading in bed, a book I wasn't retaining anything from, when I heard the sound of something being moved in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of sound that furniture makes when it is dragged across old floorboards. Back and forth, a rhythmic labor that suggested purpose. I got out of bed. I went to my door and opened it. The hallway was exactly as it had been when I went to bed. Nothing had been moved. Everything was in its place, the small table at the far end, the narrow shelves that held nothing. But the floorboards in the center of the hallway showed a faint pattern, barely visible in the darkness. Dust had been disturbed. Something heavy had been dragged across the boards, leaving traces that would be gone by morning. And the smell, that old flower smell, was so strong now that I could taste it, like breathing through dried rose petals. I closed my door and locked it. This was a new habit I had developed, though I knew that a locked door would stop nothing if something had decided it needed to move through the hallway on a particular night. But the mechanical act of turning the lock gave me something to do with my hands, something that mimicked control. The next morning, I made a decision. I had bought tools when I first arrived, a hammer, a pry bar, the standard equipment of someone beginning a renovation. I had never used them. Now, I went to the closet where I had stored them and I retrieved the pry bar. It was heavier than I remembered, cold metal that felt purposeful in my hand. The wallpaper door had become a kind of focus point, a place where my attention compressed itself. But it was not the hallway that needed investigation. The hallway was a symptom. What I needed to understand was the architecture behind it. I began at the master bedroom. Using measurements I had taken carefully, comparing them against the exterior dimensions of the house, I identified a section of the interior wall that did not correspond to what should have been there. It was subtle, perhaps 3 feet wide, positioned behind the closet. The space that the house claimed did not exist. I used the pry bar on the drywall. It came away in pieces, revealing the darker material behind it. Plaster, old and crumbling, and behind that, something else. Not wood. Not the original structure I expected. Stone, fitted carefully, mortared seamlessly. An older wall, built before the drywall, before the renovations that had created this bedroom. A wall that had been deliberately covered over and hidden. I kept working, my hands accumulating dust and debris. The stone wall was smooth, too smooth to have been built 100 years ago. This was newer, built perhaps 50 years ago, maybe less. Someone had constructed this wall deliberately. Someone had decided that whatever was on the other side of it needed to be sealed away. I stopped working. I sat on the floor of my bedroom, surrounded by pieces of drywall, and I tried to understand what I was seeing. That night, the house made its move. The footsteps in the hallway did not walk past my door. Instead, they stopped directly outside it. I heard the sound of breathing, not labored but present. Patient, the kind of breathing that someone does when they are waiting for a door to open. I did not open it. I lay in bed, every muscle tense, and I listened while whatever was outside my door waited for morning. The breathing never changed. It did not leave. It simply remained there, consistent and patient, for hours. When dawn came, it was gone. But on the floor just outside my door, I found something that changed everything. It was a photograph, face down on the hardwood. Old photograph, the kind with the soft focus and the slight color shift that came from processing in the 1970s. On the back, in handwriting that was neither rushed nor careful, someone had written a single word, please. I turned it over. The photograph showed this house, the master bedroom specifically, but in the photograph, the walls were different. The closet did not exist. And where the closet should have been, there was a doorway. A woman stood in that doorway, facing the camera. She was smiling. Behind her, visible through the doorway, there was darkness so complete that it seemed to absorb the light of the photograph itself. I did not recognize the woman, but I recognized something in the expression on her face. It was the expression of someone who had found exactly what she was looking for. I placed the photograph on my nightstand. I didn't know why. I thought perhaps I might need to look at it again. I thought perhaps it was important that I understand what I was seeing. But mostly, I knew that putting it down felt like an acknowledgment, a small agreement that I had begun to see this house the way it wanted to be seen. The wallpapered door opened on its own the next morning. I didn't touch it. I simply came out of my room and found it standing fully open, the hallway beyond it visible in the gray morning light. And the hallway was different. It was longer. The wall at the end of it was no longer cream-colored. Behind where that wall had been, there was now a passage, a doorway. And from that doorway, I could see the faint suggestion of space. Another room, another hallway, another part of the house that was trying to remember itself into existence. The smell of old flowers was overwhelming. It filled my lungs. It filled the hallway. It seemed to be coming from that distant doorway, drifting toward me like an invitation. I was holding the photograph. I didn't remember picking it up from my nightstand, but it was in my hand. The woman in the photograph was still smiling. She was still standing in that impossible doorway, waiting for someone to find their way through. I understood then that I was going to walk toward that passage. I understood that I had been going to walk toward it since the moment I inherited this house. I understood that the measurements I had taken, the doors I had opened, the walls I had broken into, all of these had been a form of agreement, a kind of conversation between myself and this place about what it wanted to become. The hallway stretched out before me. The passage at its end was growing clearer, and somewhere behind the walls, in the spaces that the house had kept sealed and hidden, I could hear the sound of footsteps, not pacing this time, walking toward me. I took a step forward, then another. The door to my bedroom swung shut behind me as I moved deeper into the hallway. I did not turn around. I did not need to. I was exactly where the house had been waiting for me to arrive. The house was silent for 3 days. Not the silence of an empty space, but the silence of something holding its breath. I moved through the rooms like I was walking through water, each step deliberate, each movement measured. The air felt thicker somehow, as though the house had drawn itself inward, folding back into its own walls. I could feel the weight of it, the waiting. I didn't go back to the hallway. I told myself this was deliberate, a choice I was making. I moved to the kitchen instead. I cleaned. I opened windows and let the October air move through the rooms, and for a few hours the house felt almost like a normal place again, a structure of wood and plaster, something built by human hands to shelter human lives, something that could be lived in without the constant feeling of being watched from inside the walls. But by evening, the windows wouldn't stay open. They'd swing closed on their own, softly, without drama, and the smell would come back, not overpowering this time, but present, persistent, like the last whisper of something that had exhaled into every corner and refused to fully dissipate. I ate standing at the kitchen counter. I didn't trust sitting down. I didn't trust staying anywhere too long, as though movement itself was a form of resistance. On the 4th day, I realized I could no longer remember what the hallway had looked like before. Not clearly. The memory had become soft, uncertain. When I tried to recall the exact color of the walls, I found instead an image that seemed to shift between cream and something else, something the light had never quite reached. When I tried to remember how long the hallway had always been, I found two different measurements in my mind, and I couldn't determine which one was real. I checked my notes. I had written down measurements before everything changed. 8 feet 9 inches. I had drawn diagrams. I had photographed the space. But the photographs were different now. Not dramatically, nothing obvious. But the walls in my photographs appeared to extend slightly further than I remembered. The shadows fell at different angles. In one corner, there was a suggestion of a door frame that I was certain had not been there when I pressed the shutter button. I stopped taking photographs. I found myself drawn to the wallpapered door instead, not to open it, but to sit near it, to listen. There was something almost companionable about being close to it. The house felt less agitated when I stayed nearby. The creaking in the walls would diminish. The sound of that movement, those footsteps, or something resembling them, would fade into the background like music played in another room. I began to understand that the house had not wanted me to go deeper. The doorway in that impossible hallway had not been an ending point. It had been a test, a moment of choice disguised as an inevitability. And somewhere in that suspended second before I had stepped forward, in the space between intention and action, I had chosen something else. I had chosen to stop. The relief in the house had been palpable. Things began to settle after that. Not normalize exactly. The wallpaper door was still there, but it remained closed. The hallway beyond it seemed to have receded back into whatever private space it occupied. The woman in the photograph was still smiling, but I had turned the image face down on my nightstand. I didn't need to see her expression anymore. I understood what it meant. I stopped trying to measure the house. I stopped making notes about the spaces that didn't quite add up. I stopped looking for logical explanations for doors that opened on their own or walls that seemed to breathe. Instead, I learned to live within the ambiguity. It was #expanded middle section the house smelled like time itself. That particular staleness that accumulates when walls have stood undisturbed for decades, holding their breath. Not quite mold, though there was that too in the basement corners. It was something else. The scent of absence. Of rooms that had been closed off while the world outside continued moving forward. I found myself spending entire afternoons just standing in the hallway, letting my eyes adjust to the quality of light that filtered through the old glass. The windows were original to the house, warped, slightly bubbled, the kind that made the trees outside seem to ripple like they were underwater. The afternoon sun turned everything amber and dusty. I could trace the path of light across the hardwood floor, watching how it illuminated the particulates suspended in the air, each mote of dust moving in slow spirals, as if the house itself was breathing. The walls were papered in layers. I could feel it through my fingertips when I ran my hand along them, the slight bumps and irregularities where one pattern had been pasted over another. Someone had covered the faded roses with geometric patterns. Then Someone else had covered that with a settled damask. I found myself wondering about each choice, each decision to hide what came before. There was something almost mournful about it, as if the house had been trying to forget itself, papering over its own history. The floorboards told their own story through sound. Some creaked with a sharp, immediate protest. Others groaned only after a moment of delay, as if considering whether to announce your presence. I began to know their language, which steps would betray me and which would carry me silently from room to room. It became a strange kind of meditation, learning the rhythm of the house's old bones. At night, I'd lie in the master bedroom and listen to the structure settle. That's what people call it, settling. The contraction and expansion of wood in response to temperature changes. But there was something almost deliberate about the sounds. A creak in the wall behind my head, a soft pop from the corner near the closet, the sound of something shifting, something adjusting itself like the house was moving in its sleep. I began to notice the cold spots. Not dramatically cold, nothing so theatrical as that. But there were places where the temperature seemed to exist in its own pocket, untouched by the season outside. The corner of the upstairs hallway where the light was always slightly grayer. A section of the master bedroom that felt colder no matter what the thermostat claimed. The space directly in front of the attic door where, even on warm evenings, I could feel the difference on my skin. Not a draft. There was no air movement, just cold, as if the temperature itself had forgotten how to flow naturally through that particular space. The stairs became an obsession. Each time I climbed them, I'd count. 13 steps to the second floor. 13 every time. But I could have sworn, in those early days of exploring the house, that I'd counted 14. Or was it 12? I'd reach the top and feel a strange disorientation, as if I'd traveled a different distance than my body understood. My legs would remember 13 steps, but my mind would question whether that was accurate. I started writing it down. Always 13. The numbers never lied. But the sensation of wrongness persisted. There was a window in the second-floor hallway that looked out onto what should have been the side yard. I stood there one afternoon and studied the angle of the glass, trying to understand the geometry of the house. The window seemed to be positioned where, by all logical understanding of the building's structure, there should have been an interior wall. Yet here it was, framing a view of the oak tree and the hedge beyond. Every time I stood at that window, I experienced the same moment of cognitive dissonance, a brief, uncomfortable sensation that the space didn't quite add up. As if the room dimensions on the inside didn't quite match what the outside could contain. The smell changed by room. The living room held the scent of old leather and something faintly metallic, like copper left to oxidize. The kitchen smelled of mineral deposits in old water pipes, and something sweetly chemical, maybe from decades of cleaning products, or maybe just the ghost of them. The bedroom I'd chosen for myself smelled like lavender and dust, which seemed impossible because I'd found nothing to account for the lavender. No sachets, no dried flowers, just the lingering memory of something that had been there long ago. I found myself developing strange rituals around the space. I would open the windows at precisely 4 in the afternoon, letting the fresh air cycle through for exactly 15 minutes. I couldn't explain why this specific time and duration felt necessary, only that when I deviated from it, the house seemed to hold itself tighter, the staleness thickening, the cold spots becoming more pronounced. I would walk the perimeter of the second floor clockwise before bed, trailing my fingers along the walls as if that simple contact could somehow ground me. The silence of the house was not empty. It was full, occupied not by sound but by the absence of it, a presence defined entirely by what wasn't there. No traffic sounds from the road, no neighbors, no birds. The silence was so complete it had texture. It pressed against my eardrums. Some mornings I'd wake with a sense of profound isolation, as if the house had sealed itself off from the rest of the world during the night. I'd find myself drawn to the mirrors. There were 3, one in the upstairs hallway, one in the master bedroom, and one in the guest bath. I'd stand before them and study my own reflection, looking for what? Confirmation? But there was always that slight delay, that fraction of a second where my reflection seemed to lag behind my movements. Nothing dramatic, nothing I could definitively prove, just a persistent sense that the mirrors weren't quite keeping up with the present moment, as if they held their images for just a heartbeat too long before releasing them. The house contained corners and places where there shouldn't be corners, angles that seemed to create alcoves and recesses that my mental map of the space couldn't quite accommodate. I'd stand in the hallway and trace the line of the wall, trying to understand where the bedroom ended and the hallway truly began, and I'd find myself confused by the settled jogs and offsets. The builders had used irregular spaces, or the house had settled in ways that made some walls slightly bowed. Either way, the geometry was no longer perfect. It was almost conscious in its imperfection, almost deliberate. Harder than I expected. My mind wanted certainty. It wanted facts and measurements and explanations that conformed to the physical laws I had spent my life understanding. But the house had taught me something in those few days of escalation. Certainty was a luxury that only existed in spaces that had nothing to hide. This house had plenty to hide. By the second week, I had settled into something resembling routine. I made coffee in the mornings. I sat by the kitchen window. I read books without absorbing the words. I moved through the rooms, and the rooms accommodated my presence the way an organism tolerates a foreign object in its body, without hostility, but without true welcome either. The smell of old flowers never entirely left. I stopped noticing it most of the time, the way you stop noticing any constant sensory input. But it would return to consciousness occasionally, a sharp reminder that the house was still here, still present, still maintaining whatever existence it had decided for itself. In the evenings, I would sometimes hear the footsteps again. They moved through the walls with purpose now, never toward me, always moving through some space I couldn't quite locate. I had learned not to follow the sound. I had learned not to try to trace its path or predict its destination. The walking simply was. Like the wind, like the settling of old wood, like the memory of someone who had loved this house so thoroughly that even now, in whatever form she occupied, she couldn't quite bring herself to leave. I never opened the wallpaper door again. But one morning I found something small on the floor in front of it, a button, the kind that came from old clothing, bone, probably, or something that had once been bone. It was cream-colored, slightly yellowed by time, with 2 holes for thread. Nothing marked it as remarkable. Nothing suggested it had come from anywhere special. I picked it up. It was warm, as though someone had been holding it just moments before I found it. I placed it on the windowsill in my bedroom, not as evidence, not as a question, but as an acknowledgment, a small agreement that I had begun to understand the terms of living in a house that refused to remain entirely in the past. The button sits there still, catching the afternoon light when the sun is in the right position. Sometimes I notice it. Sometimes I forget it's there. Sometimes I find myself wondering whether it was always there, and I'm only now learning to see the things that this house has been trying to show me all along. Most nights, I don't think about any of it. I simply listen to the footsteps moving through the walls, that steady, purposeful rhythm, and I recognize it for what it is. Not a haunting, just a presence that refuses to be forgotten. And that is perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. Not that the house contains something, but that I've begun to accept it so completely that I can no longer remember what it felt like to be afraid. Story 3. The guest bedroom door that opens to someone else's morning. The floorboards in the hallway creak in a particular way when you step on the 3rd board from the wall. I know this now because I've learned to avoid them. It's late September, and I've been living in my great-aunt's farmhouse for just over 3 weeks. The house came to me with a handwritten note from a lawyer explaining that Aunt Catherine had no other living relations, and that I was to inherit the property along with everything inside it. I'd never met her. There was a funeral, a small one, and then the keys. The house smelled like old paper and lavender when I first opened the door. The Victorian farmhouse sits about 4 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by fields that have gone to seed. The structure itself is impressive in the way old houses can be, all gables and brick chimneys with a wraparound porch that sags slightly on the eastern side. The grounds are mature, ancient oaks, an overgrown garden, a barn I haven't yet gathered the courage to explore. Inside, the rooms are numerous and poorly lit. Most contain furniture I have no practical use for: hutches, wardrobes, chairs with horsehair stuffing that pricks through the upholstery. The windows are hung with heavy velvet curtains that block out most of the daylight, which seems to be by design. Aunt Catherine apparently preferred her world dim. I chose the master bedroom as my own. It has the most light and the largest attached bathroom. but I've been sleeping in the guest room. The guest bedroom is on the second floor, at the end of the main hallway. It's smaller than the master, quieter somehow, despite being in the same house. The walls are covered in a delicate floral wallpaper in cream and pale green, the pattern so intricate that if you stare at it too long, it begins to form other images. The bed frame is wrought iron, painted white, with a thin mattress that smells of stored linen. There's a vanity with a mirror that reflects the room slightly out of true. Your face sits a few inches lower than it should, which I've attributed to the age of the glass. The door to this room has always been slightly ajar. On my first night in the house, I closed it. It was a soft closure, deliberate, the kind you make when you want privacy without making a statement. The latch caught with a small, definitive click. I remember being satisfied with the sound. It meant something. Safety, probably, or the illusion of it. I was alone in a house that had belonged to a stranger. The closed door felt necessary. The next morning, it was open again. Just a crack, maybe 2 inches. Enough that you could see the hallway beyond, but not enough to be alarming. I assumed I hadn't closed it properly, that the house had settled in the night and the door had simply swung free. Old houses do this. They shift and breathe. I closed it again. This became routine. Close the door. Sleep, wake to find it open. By the fourth night, I stopped trying. The decision was practical more than anything else. The house was old, the hinges were old, and apparently the door wanted to be open. There seemed little point in fighting it. I left it ajar and slept better for the acceptance of it. Sometimes the easiest thing is to stop resisting. What I notice now in these early weeks is that the hallway beyond the open door is always the same. It's narrow, with walls papered in a muted blue-gray. There's a carpet, deep burgundy, worn in a path that suggests regular traffic. To the left, about 15 feet down, is another door, this one closed. To the right, the hallway curves slightly toward what must be the main staircase. I can see the banister, dark wood, running parallel to the wall. The light in the hallway is the light that comes from the downstairs windows, filtered through those heavy curtains. It's always gray-green, like being underwater. I know this hallway. I've walked it dozens of times since moving in. It's the hallway of my great-aunt's house. Or it was. The first time I noticed something was wrong was on a Tuesday morning, about 2.5 weeks into my stay. I'd woken early, around 6, because of a dream I couldn't quite remember. The kind that leaves you unsettled but doesn't hang around long enough to examine. I lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the house wake up. The September morning was still dark outside, that particular quality of pre-dawn darkness, where you can't yet tell if it's going to be a good day or a gray one. The guest room door was open, as always. I don't know why I decided to really look at the hallway that morning instead of simply glancing at it and drifting back to sleep. Maybe I was still half dreaming. Maybe the unsettled feeling from the dream had made me hyper-aware of my surroundings. Whatever the reason, I got out of bed and walked to the door. The hallway was different. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing, because it was the same hallway, but not. The carpet was the same burgundy, but it was thick and new-looking without the worn path. The walls were the same color, but the paper was unwrinkled, pristine. The banister was the same dark wood, but it gleamed. The light was different. Not the gray-green submarine light I'd come to expect, but something warmer, golden, the kind of light that comes from sunrise hitting windows that are actually clean. And it was morning somewhere else. I mean that literally. The quality of the light told me it was a different time of day. The same layout, the same bones of the house, but daylight was arriving from a different angle. The windows downstairs must have been facing a direction I'd become confused about. Or the sun was somewhere else in the sky, coming from somewhere unexpected. I told myself this. I tried to convince myself. I was still half asleep, I thought. The light was playing tricks. The house was old and my eyes weren't focused. All very reasonable explanations, the kind you make when you notice something your mind isn't ready to process. And then I heard footsteps. They were distant, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. A steady, measured pace, someone walking through the rooms below. Then a voice, a woman's voice, calling out something I couldn't quite make out. The words were too far away to be distinct, but the tone was clear. Instructions, maybe, a question. Something that required a response. I didn't respond. I stood in the doorway of the guest room, my hand on the edge of the doorframe, and I didn't respond. I didn't move. I think I wasn't breathing, though I can't be sure. What I remember clearly is the absolute certainty that if I made any noise at all, the footsteps would stop. The woman would hear me. And I very much did not want to be heard. The footsteps continued for a while longer. They moved through what I thought might be the downstairs sitting room, or perhaps the parlor. Across the hardwood that I knew was actually carpet in my version of the house, but was clearly hardwood here, in this version. The woman's voice called out again, no more distinct than before. No one answered. The footsteps eventually faded. The light didn't change. I waited for several minutes. My hand had gone numb, gripping the doorframe. When I finally pulled it away, there were marks in my palm from the wood. I turned back into the guest room, my room, and closed the door. Not with a soft click this time, but firmly, as if force could matter. The hallway on the other side went back to being the hallway I knew. I know this because I opened the door again, maybe 10 minutes later. I can't explain why. Pure stupidity, maybe, or the part of human nature that looks at a closed door and wants to open it again just to see if the impossible has resolved itself into something manageable. The hallway was gray-green again. The carpet was worn. The light was submarine. The footsteps were gone. The woman had gone. I didn't open the door again that day. I showered, hot water, which is still a luxury in this old house, and made coffee in the kitchen. I tried to move methodically through the morning, as if the morning was still mine to move through, as if something hadn't slipped sideways in the world I was living in. I read a book that I'd read before, something familiar and unchallenging. I made myself soup for lunch even though I wasn't hungry. I was waiting for something, though I didn't know what. Evidence, maybe, proof that I'd imagined the whole thing. By evening, I had almost convinced myself that I had. That night, I closed the guest room door before bed. I closed it tight, and I stayed in the master bedroom instead. The master bedroom is larger, colder, with a view of the overgrown garden and the barn. The mattress is softer, but less comfortable somehow. I lay awake, listening to the house move around me, settling and shifting in ways I'd become accustomed to. I thought about Aunt Catherine, who had lived here alone for how long. The lawyer's letter hadn't specified. I thought about her sleeping in one of these rooms, listening to this same house in the dark. I thought about what she might have heard, what she might have seen if she'd left her door open. The next morning I went back to the guest room. I knew I would. Eventually, the door was open again, but the hallway was normal. My hallway. The one I'd walked hundreds of times in the past 3 weeks. Worn burgundy carpet, muted wallpaper, the banister running its familiar course. The light was what it always was. Morning in my house, in my time, in the day that actually belonged to me. Except now, I knew it belonged to someone else too. I stood in the doorway of the guest room for a long time that morning, not moving in or out. The hallway beyond was so perfectly ordinary, it felt like a punishment. I wanted to find something wrong with it, a shadow out of place, a smell I couldn't name, anything that would confirm what I'd felt the previous day wasn't a break in my mind, but something external, something that had actually happened. But there was nothing. Just hallway. Just house. I closed the door again and went downstairs. The coffee maker had left a ring on the counter, a dark stain in a perfect circle. I'd cleaned that counter 3 days ago. I knew I had. But there it was. And it took me 20 minutes to decide whether I'd actually cleaned it at all, or whether I'd only meant to. The house was already beginning to work on me in that way. I spent most of the day in the library, which is what the realtor had called the small room off the eastern parlor, though Aunt Catherine had clearly used it as something else. A room to sit in. A room to wait in. The shelves still held the books she'd accumulated, dense literary novels from decades past, their spines cracked and faded. I pulled one down at random and found her name written inside the front cover in handwriting that was careful and precise. Catherine M. Whitmore, 1987. She'd owned this house for longer than I'd been alive. I tried to read, but didn't. I sat instead watching the light move across the floor in that slow coastal way, as if the sun was apologizing for its brightness by moving so carefully across the wood. Around 4 o'clock, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Not heavy, not light, just footsteps. The kind you make when you're walking normally, without intention or drama. I was on my feet before I'd consciously decided to stand. I moved to the doorway of the library and looked out into the hallway. The stairs curved up to the second floor, and I could see the landing, the corridor, the arrangement of closed doors. Nothing was moving. Nothing was visible. I waited for a full minute, then climbed the stairs myself. Each step was deliberate. I was testing to see if the sound repeated, if it was just the house settling in some particular way. But there were no more sounds. The second floor was silent in that way a second floor can be when it's completely unoccupied, a dead air, a held breath. I went to the guest room. The door was closed. I opened it carefully as if it might bite me. The room was exactly as I'd left it. The bed I'd slept in once, the small desk, the window overlooking the side yard where trees had grown too close to the house. Nothing had changed. Nothing was there. That evening, I made dinner in the kitchen, something simple, something that wouldn't require much attention. As I was washing the dishes, I noticed that the kitchen window, which looks onto the back garden, showed my reflection back at me in the dark glass. But the reflection was fractionally delayed. I could see my hands moving in the sink, then see them reflected a moment later, as if they were moving through water, as if there was a layer between me and myself. I told myself it was a trick of the glass, the old house, the quality of light at dusk. I cleaned more dishes. The next morning, I found the guest room door open again. And this time, there was something different. The hallway beyond it was not my hallway. The light was wrong, a kind of greenish submarine quality that made the carpet look like something growing at the bottom of a pool. The wallpaper seemed faded almost to nothing, a ghost pattern that had been there too long. And at the far end of the hallway, near the stairs, I could see a figure standing perfectly still. She was there only for a moment. A woman in clothing I couldn't quite see clearly, something gray or blue, something from a time that didn't have a name. Her hair was light-colored, her hands were at her sides. And then she was not there, and the hallway was my hallway again, bright and ordinary and utterly empty. I closed the door immediately. I sat on the edge of the bed, which was not comfortable and never had been. I tried to remember if I'd actually seen a face, if I could describe her with any certainty if someone asked me. I couldn't. I could only remember the way she stood, with that particular stillness of someone who is waiting for something to happen. Over the next few days, the occurrences began to multiply. Small things. The kind of things that would make anyone doubt their own observation. I would go to close the front door and find it already closed, latched from the inside. I would walk past the library and see it lit from within, though I knew I hadn't turned on the lights, and when I went in, the lights would be off and the room would be dim. I found a window in the back parlor, a room I'd only walked through twice, open just enough to let in the autumn air. The screen was intact. I didn't remember opening it. The kitchen, which had been empty of everything except my own purchased groceries, began to show signs of occupation. A cup on the counter that I knew I'd put away. A dish towel folded in thirds over the oven rail, folded in a way I wouldn't fold it. A plant on the windowsill that hadn't been there the previous day. Small and green and unremarkable, thriving, despite my certain knowledge that I had never bought it. I didn't remove the plant. I couldn't explain why. It seemed important to leave it where it was, to leave everything exactly as it had been arranged, as if any disturbance might cause something to tip into being more obvious, more undeniable, more real. The woman appeared in the guest room hallway twice more. Once in the afternoon when the light was bright and clear, and once in the evening just as the sun was setting. Each time she was standing in a slightly different position, closer to my door or farther away, or turned as if she was looking at the wall. I never saw her face. I never wanted to. But the sense of her became clearer, more substantial. The sense that she had weight and purpose and a reason for being in this hallway, in this house, in this thin place between times where the doors didn't work in the way doors were supposed to work. I began to understand that the guest room door was a kind of threshold, that it opened differently depending on when you opened it, that on some occasions it opened onto my morning, my house, my life, and on other occasions it opened onto hers. I had inherited this house, but the house, it seemed, had come furnished with someone else's persistence, with someone else's refusal to leave, with someone else's mourning that stretched on and on in that hallway, in that gray-green light, with that particular and terrible patience of the dead, or something like it. I kept the guest room door closed most of the time now, but every morning, without fail, I would find it open. And every morning I would stand in my doorway and look at the hallway beyond, waiting to see which time period it would show me, waiting to see how much closer she'd move toward whatever she was looking for, waiting, despite everything, for her to finally turn around. It happened on a morning in late October, 4 weeks into my life with the house and the woman and the door that no longer obeyed the simple physics of hinges and locks. I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. This was different from the watching. This was different from the settled movements of objects, the rearrangement of the invisible. This was deliberate and rhythmic, the sound of someone walking the length of the guest room hallway, back and forth, with the measured pace of someone pacing. Thinking, deciding, I lay in the dark of my bedroom and counted. 17 steps from the far end of the hallway to my door. 17 steps back again. Then a pause. Then the same path repeated. The floorboards creaked in sequence, each one groaning under weight that I could not see but could no longer deny. I didn't move. Moving felt like acknowledgment, and acknowledgment felt like surrender. The pacing continued for what might have been an hour. Time had become unreliable in the house. Minutes stretched, hours compressed. The footsteps maintained their rhythm regardless, a pattern of such consistency that it began to feel less like hesitation and more like ritual, like something being marked, like a path being worn into the wood not just physically, but somehow spiritually, as if the very act of walking the same route again and again was etching it more deeply into the structure of things. When the footsteps finally stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. The kind of silence that has weight and presence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears like water. I got out of bed. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Fear might have driven me toward the door, or curiosity, or some deeper instinct to face the thing I'd been avoiding. But I pulled on a sweater over my sleep clothes and opened my bedroom door, and I stepped into the hallway. The guest room door was open. It was open in a way that felt deliberate, inviting, not just ajar, but positioned at a specific angle, as if someone had carefully arranged it. The hallway beyond was that gray-green half-light that I'd come to recognize as belonging to her time, her mourning, her refusal to accept the passage of years. The air that came through the doorway was cold and still, and it carried a smell I had not encountered before. Not unpleasant, not exactly. It was the smell of a space that has been closed off, preserved like something in amber. Old wood. Dust. Something floral and faded, like flowers pressed between pages for decades. I could see the far end of her hallway. The carpet, a different carpet than the one in my version of the house, darker, more ornate, stretched away into shadow. The wallpaper was a pattern of small roses, the kind that might have been fashionable 70 years ago. The light came from no visible source, as if the hallway itself was generating its own dim illumination. And standing at the far end, perhaps 20 feet away, was the woman. She was perfectly still. Her back was to me. She was wearing a dress or a nightgown, something long and pale, something that might once have been cream-colored but had taken on the gray tones of the light around her. Her hair was dark, long, and she was looking at the wall. There was a doorway there, I realized. A doorway I hadn't noticed before because I'd never looked that far into her hallway. It was a mirror image of mine, framed in wood, painted white, closed. She was standing in front of it with her hand raised, not quite touching the surface, and her head tilted as if she was listening to something. I took a step forward, just one, just enough to fully cross the threshold between my world and hers. The temperature dropped immediately. My breath clouded. My hands went cold, then numb. But I could move. I could walk forward. The carpet beneath my feet felt wrong, too thick, too soft, as if I was walking on something that had been dead for a very long time. The woman's hand dropped. She turned. Not quickly. Not with the sudden jerk of something startled. She turned with the slow, deliberate motion of someone who had known I was coming all along, who had been waiting for this, who had been pacing back and forth in that hallway for years, or decades, building up to this exact moment. And I could see her face. Not clearly. The light was too dim, and it seemed to slip away from her features, as if her face was something the hallway didn't quite want to hold in focus. But I could see the shape of it, the placement of her eyes, dark, so dark, filled with a kind of patient recognition. Her mouth, which was slightly open as if she was about to speak, or as if she had been speaking for a very long time and had simply never stopped. She was young. Or she had been. There was something preserved about her, something that existed in a permanent state of being caught between moments. She might have been 30. She might have been younger. She might have been timeless in the way that certain kinds of absence are timeless, not belonging to any particular era, but to the gaps between them. She took a step toward me. I took a step backward. "Don't," I said. My voice sounded thin, small, wrong in that hallway. It didn't echo. The hallway seemed to absorb it, to swallow it whole. She stopped. She tilted her head. And then, and this was what broke something in me, what made it impossible to continue explaining or rationalizing or pretending this was explainable, she smiled. It was a sad smile. A knowing smile. The smile of someone who had been trying to tell me something and had finally realized that I was actually listening. "I can't leave," she said. Her voice was barely audible, like wind through a distant room, like someone speaking from the other side of glass. But I heard it, every word, clear and desperate and utterly certain. "I opened the door," she said, "and now I can't close it. Do you understand? The door is open, and I can't. I've tried to close it. I've tried every morning, and every morning it opens, and every morning I think this is the time when I'll be able to stay where I'm supposed to be, but there's someone else on the other side, and they keep walking through, and they keep leaving it open, and I can't." Her voice had begun to rise, to fracture, like something struggling to maintain form. "It won't close," she said. "It won't close. It hasn't closed. You have to," but I was already backing away. I didn't close the door. I couldn't. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but retreat, step after step, back toward my own hallway, my own time, my own morning. The woman remained where she was, watching me go, and her face was still kind, still patient, but there was something desperate beneath it now, something that had been growing for a very long time. I stumbled back through the threshold. The change was immediate. The carpet under my feet became the familiar texture of the hallway in my house. The walls became their pale, neutral color. The light became the natural light of an October morning, autumn sun coming through the distant windows. But the guest room door remained open. I stood there, breathing hard, and I could feel her on the other side. Could feel her waiting, could feel the weight of whatever she had been trying to tell me, and the terrifying certainty that I hadn't fully understood it. My hand moved toward the door. Every instinct screamed at me to close it, to lock it, to find a way to seal it shut and pretend that none of this was happening. But I didn't, because somewhere in the chaos of what I just heard, one thing had become clear. The door wasn't the problem. The door was just the symptom, and closing it wouldn't help her. It would only trap her on the other side, still walking that hallway, still pacing, still waiting for someone to understand what she needed me to do. I left the door open, and I began, very carefully, to explore the rest of the house. The rest of that day exists in my memory as something fractured and dim, like trying to remember a conversation overheard in another room. I know I moved through the house. I know I opened doors, the linen closet, the bathroom cabinet, the coat cupboard beneath the stairs, as if searching for something I couldn't name. I know I found nothing, or rather, I found everything exactly as it should be. Folded towels, bottles of shampoo, winter jackets hanging in their proper darkness. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was out of place. But everything was different. By noon, I had convinced myself that I should leave. This was not a thought that arrived gradually or through rational consideration. It simply became the only possible course of action, as obvious and necessary as breathing. I would pack a bag. I would lock the house behind me. I would drive to a hotel, or perhaps to my sister's place in the city. I would stay away for a night, just one night, and when I returned, something would have reset. The door would be closed. The woman would be gone. The house would be mine again in the way that it had been when I inherited it, full of the accumulated silence of people I'd never met. But at least that silence was passive. At least it stayed where it belonged. I pulled out my suitcase from the back of my closet. Methodically, I began to pack. Clean clothes, my laptop, my phone charger, things that seemed important, though I wasn't certain why. The whole time, I was aware of the guest room door, still open, still waiting at the end of the hallway. I didn't look at it. I didn't go near it. But I could feel it the way you feel someone watching you from across a dark room. A presence that has nothing to do with sight and everything to do with a shift in the quality of the air. As I folded a sweater, I heard something, a sound from downstairs, very small, very deliberate, the sound of a door closing, not slamming, closing, with the kind of gentle precision that suggests intention. I went to the railing and looked down. The front door was shut, but it had been shut when I came inside this morning. I was certain of it, almost certain. The certainty was already beginning to fray at the edges, the way certainty does when it's been in the company of the impossible. I went downstairs. I checked the locks. Everything was secure. And yet there was something on the welcome mat. Outside, I could see it through the small pane of glass beside the doorframe. A single object, pale and geometrical against the dark fabric. I opened the door. It was an envelope. Cream-colored, aged, the kind that had been out of style for decades. My name was written on it in careful, deliberate handwriting, not printed. Handwritten, and the handwriting was mine. Not a forgery of my handwriting, not similar to it. It was exactly, precisely my handwriting. Down to the particular slant of the letters, the way I dotted my I's, the slight loop at the end of my G's. I picked it up. My hands were shaking. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. And on it, in that same impossible handwriting, were 2 sentences. You understand now. Please don't leave the door open when you go. I read it 3 times, 4 times, each time hoping that the meaning would shift, would become something that made sense in the context of the world I understood. But it didn't shift. It only deepened, the way a well deepens when you drop a stone and never hear the bottom. I stood there on the threshold between the outside and the inside, the letter trembling in my fingers, and a thought occurred to me with the weight of absolute clarity. I was not the person the woman in the hallway had been waiting for. I was the person she had been waiting to become. The distinction shouldn't have mattered, but it did. It explained everything with a logic that transcended reason. The way she'd smiled at me with sad recognition. The way she'd spoken as if we'd been having a conversation that had started long before I'd walked through that threshold. The way she'd said the door was open and wouldn't close. She had been trying to warn me. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that moved through me like cold water, she had been trying to tell me that I would someday stand where she was standing. In that hallway that belonged to neither morning nor night, walking in circles, trying to close a door that an infinite succession of future versions of myself would keep opening. I put the letter back in the envelope. I returned to my suitcase. I changed my mind about leaving. I changed my mind about the letter. I put the suitcase back in the closet. I tried not to think about any of it. For 3 days, I moved through the house as if I were the ghost and the house was the haunted place. I cooked meals I didn't eat. I read pages of books without understanding a single word. I slept at odd hours, waking at 4 a.m., with my heart racing and no memory of why. The guest room door remained open. I never closed it. I never went back through it. But I felt it every moment, a small breach in the architecture of my life, a threshold I'd crossed that I would never be able to uncross. On the 4th morning, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in my bathroom, studying my own face with the intensity of someone trying to determine whether they'd aged overnight. I looked tired. IL hashtag additional middle section environmental immersion the house settled into that particular silence that comes just before dawn. The kind of quiet that feels deliberate, like the building itself is holding its breath. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, listening to the weight of stillness pressing against the walls around me. 3 weeks into living here, and I still hadn't adjusted to how the silence felt textured. It wasn't absence, it was presence disguised as emptiness. The guest bedroom door occupied my thoughts in the way you can't stop probing a loose tooth with your tongue. I knew better than to go back there so soon. The rational part of me, the part that had served me well in my previous apartment. My previous life insisted that I was catastrophizing. Doors opened, old houses shifted. There were explanations for everything if you didn't look too hard. But I wasn't sleeping anyway. The master bedroom where I'd been spending my nights felt increasingly foreign. High ceilings I could barely see in the dark. A radiator that clanked at irregular intervals like something trying to communicate in Morse code. The wallpaper, a muted damask pattern that had probably been elegant once, held the accumulated smell of decades. Not unpleasant exactly. More like the scent of time itself. Dust and old fabric and something floral that had faded into abstraction. I'd been sleeping with the bedroom door open. This was new for me. I'd always preferred doors closed, locks engaged, barriers between myself and the rest of the world. But something about this house made enclosed spaces feel wrong, coffin-like, as if the walls were drawing closer the moment I shut myself away from the hallway. So I left it open, and I lay there listening to the house breathe around me. The hallway beyond the threshold existed in perpetual half-light, even at midnight. The windows facing the street let in a diffuse glow that never quite faded to true darkness. I could trace the outline of the banister, the archway leading to the stairs, the closed door of the guest bedroom about 20 feet away. It was positioned perpendicular to the master bedroom across the hallway. During the day, when sunlight poured through the upper hallway windows, I could see its proportions clearly. A narrow white door with an old brass knob, the paint chipped in places to reveal darker wood underneath. At night, it became an absence, a shape cut out of shadow. I'd begun keeping a notebook on my nightstand, not because I expected to document anything. That felt presumptuous, almost theatrical, but because writing things down made them feel more manageable. Tuesday, 2:47 a.m. Heard footsteps in the hall, or the sound of them, like something moving through the layers of the house itself. I'd close the notebook immediately afterward, as if the words might escape and rearrange themselves into accusations. The house had opinions about temperature. This was the first winter I'd noticed it, though I was beginning to suspect it was always this way. Certain rooms maintained a consistent cool that had nothing to do with the thermostat. The guest bedroom's hallway sector, for instance. I'd walked past it this morning with a coffee mug and had registered an immediate temperature drop. 5, maybe 10 degrees. Cold that didn't feel like the absence of heat, but rather like a presence pressing against the warmer air, containing it. When I'd stood still for a moment testing it, I could feel the line where the cold ended and normal air began, sharp as a wall. The hardwood floors creaked in patterns. I'd mapped them mentally over the past weeks. The third board from the master bedroom door, the section of hallway near the linen closet where the wood had warped enough to produce 3 separate groans underweight. The landing at the top of the stairs where old nails had worked loose in the subfloor, creating a sound like a small creature shifting in the walls. But there were footsteps that didn't follow these patterns. I hadn't mentioned this in my notebook. Writing it felt like giving it too much credibility. But I'd heard them, soft impacts on the hardwood, regular and purposeful, moving from the guest bedroom toward the stairs, once at 1:15 a.m., again at 3:40. They had weight to them, presence, the sound of someone moving with intention through a familiar space. The kind of walking you do when you don't need to see where you're going because you know this place like muscle memory. I'd frozen both times, one hand on the coffee mug I'd knocked over, the other gripping the edge of my mattress hard enough that my fingers had gone white. But I never actually saw anything when I looked toward the hallway. Just the familiar dark shapes of the furniture I'd arranged, the glow from the street, the closed door of the guest bedroom. The smell of the house had been changing too, though I couldn't quite articulate this clearly even to myself. In my first few days it had simply smelled old, that ambient mustiness of an inherited space. But now, in the deeper hours of the night, I noticed other layers, something like lavender, but not quite. Soap, perhaps, or fabric softener from decades past. And underneath that, something else, not unpleasant, just other, the smell of a life that wasn't mine, that had soaked into the walls and the floorboards and the very air itself, and was still somehow present in the dark. I'd inherited the house from a distant relative, Morgan, according to the legal documents. I'd never met Morgan. There was a single photograph in one of the albums I'd found in the front room closet. A woman who might have been anywhere from 40 to 60, standing in the yard in what looked like the 1980s, squinting against afternoon sun. No smile, just a presence, captured in that moment before the camera clicked. I'd stared at it for longer than was probably rational, trying to extract meaning from her expression, the way she held her shoulders, trying to understand if she'd been happy here, if she'd felt welcome in this house that I now occupied, and that now occupied me in return. The floorboards in the guest bedroom hallway had their own vocabulary. I'd learned to distinguish between the sound of settling wood and the sound of weight distribution. The way the house moved was mostly gentle, almost conversational. A creak here, a groan there, nothing that demanded attention. But the hallway outside the guest bedroom produced sounds that felt intentional. A specific board that sang out when pressure was applied, the way the floor seemed to breathe in certain spots, as if something beneath the surface was gently pushing up against the wood. The radiator in the master bedroom had become my temporal reference point. It clanked at irregular intervals, but there was a pattern if you listened long enough. A series of pipes running behind the walls, heating water, releasing pressure, cooling. It should have been soothing, the sound of a system maintaining equilibrium. But the timing felt random enough that I could never quite anticipate it. Just when I'd start to relax into sleep, convinced I'd finally adapted to the rhythm, the pipes would emit a sudden bang that jolted me back to alertness. It was like living inside something alive, something with a heartbeat that skipped at random intervals. I'd been spending the hours between midnight and dawn cataloging the house's sounds. The way the old glass windows vibrated when wind pressed against them. The particular quality of silence that fell just after a car passed outside, dragging its headlights across the upper walls. The sound of the neighborhood gradually waking, a few birds starting their conversations before dawn, the distant rumble of an early garbage truck, the softer sound of a neighbor leaving for an early shift, and underneath all of it, the sound of the house itself, the sound of a structure that had held so many lives, so many days and nights and ordinary moments, all layered into the architecture. The walls humming with the accumulated presence of everyone who'd ever walked these hallways. The guest bedroom door was still closed. I could see its outline from where I sat. A thin vertical line of absolute darkness, marking the boundary between the hallway I knew and the space I'd only glimpsed. The space that had opened onto something else, somewhere else. Some other morning that didn't match my calendar. I picked up my notebook, but I didn't open it. There were some things I wasn't ready to document yet, some things that might become real if I acknowledged them in writing. So I sat in the dark, listening to the house breathe, feeling the accumulated weight of all those other mornings pressing against the walls, waiting for something I couldn't yet name to finally announce its presence, or perhaps it already had. Perhaps I'd just been too afraid to listen. Looked changed. I looked like someone who had been trying to tell a story but couldn't quite find the words, and had begun to understand that the words had never been the point. That's when I noticed something small, almost invisible. A strand of dark hair caught in the edge of my bathroom sink. It wasn't mine. It wasn't the kind of hair that belonged to the accumulated debris of a single person living alone. Someone else had been in this room. Someone else had stood at this sink, looking into this mirror. Or perhaps, and here the logic folded again, twisted into that same impossible shape, I had been in another room. Another mirror. Someone else looking back at me from the other side. I picked the hair up carefully. It was cool to the touch. I thought about throwing it away, about washing it down the drain, about pretending I hadn't seen it. Instead, I left it there, on the edge of the sink, small, undeniable, a marker that something real had passed through. Now, weeks later, I remain in the house. I have not left. The guest room door stays open. I have learned to walk past it without flinching, though it never becomes easier. I have learned to cook again, to read again, to maintain the appearance of someone living a normal life. The envelope and its impossible contents are in a drawer upstairs. Sometimes I take it out and read it again, hoping the handwriting will have changed, hoping it will finally look like something from an unknown hand, something that came from outside myself. But it never does. I have become very careful about what I do in mirrors. I've begun to notice that some mornings the light in certain rooms is wrong, too early or too late, stretching across the walls at angles that don't correspond to the position of the sun. I have learned to live with the small displacements, the moments when a door I thought I'd opened seems to have been closed, or a window appears in a wall where I know there is no window. Most days I don't think about it, but sometimes, late in the afternoon, when the light is beginning to fail and the house is settling into that particular silence that comes just before dusk, I hear something from upstairs, very faint, very deliberate, the sound of footsteps in the hallway, pacing back and forth, as if someone is walking from one end to the other over and over, waiting for a door to close. And I have to resist the urge, the terrible, insistent urge to go upstairs and look. Because I'm beginning to understand that if I do, if I finally go back and see what's there, I may find myself on the other side of something I can never return from. I may find myself in that other morning, that other hallway, with my own tired face looking back at me in confusion, about to ask someone to please understand what I'm trying to tell them. The door is still open. It will always be open. And somewhere, someone who was once me is still trying to close it. I have learned to leave it that way. Story 4. The bathroom mirror reflects rooms I've never built in this house. The mirror in my bathroom has always been slightly off-center on the wall, about an inch to the left, and I've never fixed it because I kept meaning to measure before I hung the frame. That was 3 years ago. I noticed it again the night this started. standing there in that post-shower haze where everything feels softer than it should. My bathroom isn't large, maybe 6 by 8 feet of pale tile and a pedestal sink that the previous owners left behind. I'd inherited the mirror, too, a simple rectangular thing with a beveled edge and a metal frame that had started to dull at the corners. It was the kind of object you stopped seeing after a while. Part of the wall. The steam was thick that evening. I'd run the shower hot, the way I always did, and the mirror had fogged completely white. I could hear the small drip of condensation collecting in the windowsill, that patient ticking sound. The overhead light made everything feel close and warm. I remember thinking I should turn on the exhaust fan. I always think that and rarely do, as I reached for the hand towel. I wiped the mirror in horizontal strokes, the way I usually did, working from left to right. The fog came away damp against the cloth, and I watched my face materialize in sections. Forehead first, eyes. The slope of my nose that I'd never been entirely happy with, but had made peace with somewhere in my 20s. That's when I stopped. Behind my reflection, in the mirror's depth, there was a hallway. Not the hallway of my house. I know my house. I've walked every inch of it since I moved in. I know the scratch on the baseboard near my bedroom door where I caught the corner of a box. I know the slight lean of the hallway floor toward the bathroom. Something about the settling of the foundation that makes you feel like you're descending even when you're walking straight. I know the particular shade of off-white I painted the walls, a color called linen, that looked yellow in certain light and gray in others. This hallway was different. It stretched behind me, or appeared to stretch, deeper than any hallway in my house could possibly go. The walls were a darker color, not quite beige, not quite tan, something closer to the inside of a mushroom. Soft, muted, I could see a doorway maybe 10 feet back. Its frame dark wood or maybe just shadow. The lighting was indirect, coming from somewhere I couldn't identify, creating a dim luminescence that made the space feel less like the interior of a house and more like the bottom of something. I blinked. The hallway was still there. I looked behind me, actually turned around, away from the mirror, to look at my actual bathroom wall. The door was to my left. The small window above the toilet looked out onto the neighbor's fence. Everything was exactly as it should be. Small, contained, normal. When I looked back at the mirror, the hallway remained. My reflection was there too, smaller in the distance, standing in that reflected bathroom. But the space behind it, the real bathroom, the one I was standing in, that was where the hallway was. As if the mirror wasn't reflecting what was actually behind me, but something else. Something deeper. The towel was still in my hand. It was damp and slightly cool now. I remember feeling very still, not frightened yet. That came later. This was something else, that particular quality of attention that happens when your brain encounters something it can't immediately sort into a category. Like the moment before you recognize a word you've seen 1,000 times but suddenly can't recall the meaning of. The wrong kind of recognition. I reached out and touched the mirror's surface. It was warm. Not body warm, not feverish, but noticeably warm against my palm in a way that glass shouldn't be. Not from the steam. I could see the steam dissipating now, clearing toward the exhaust that I hadn't actually turned on. The warmth seemed to be coming from behind the glass itself, radiating outward. I kept my hand there for a moment, feeling it, and as I did, the hallway and the reflection shifted, not moved, shifted like a breath. Like something behind there had become aware of my touch and had adjusted itself in response. The doorway that had been 10 feet back appeared closer. 5 feet, maybe less. And I could see now that the door was slightly ajar. There was nothing visible through the gap, just darkness. I pulled my hand away from the mirror. The hallway remained. The door stayed where it was. My reflection remained exactly as it had been, standing in my bathroom, looking at the mirror. My expression the same calm confusion I could feel on my actual face. I dried my hands on the towel and hung it back on the rack, the way I always did. My movements felt deliberate, even though I wasn't trying to be deliberate. I was doing very ordinary things, hanging up a towel, collecting my shower caddy from the corner where I kept it, but everything had a strange quality of being watched. Not observed. Watched. The difference matters. The hallway and the mirror didn't change while I moved. It held steady. The door remained slightly open. The walls held their muted, fungal color. The light, that impossible, sourceless light, continued to emanate from nowhere and everywhere. By the time I left the bathroom, turning off the light switch and closing the door behind me, my heart was moving faster than I wanted to admit. But I didn't feel scared. Not really. I felt curious in a way that I couldn't shake, even as I lay in bed an hour later, unable to settle. I kept thinking about the warmth of the glass. I kept thinking about how close that doorway had gotten simply by acknowledging it. I kept thinking about what might have been on the other side of that slightly open door, and whether my reaching out to the mirror had been an invitation for something to reach back. It was a long time before I slept. The next morning, I told myself it had been exhaustion. One of those moments where the difference between dreaming and waking becomes permeable. You can convince yourself of almost anything in daylight, especially when the sun is coming through the kitchen window and the coffee tastes normal and the world is going about its ordinary business outside your walls. I didn't go back to the mirror immediately. That was probably a mistake. But I did go back. Of course I did. It took 3 days. But I went back. That's the thing about something like that. The uncertainty is worse than knowing. I'd rather know I was losing my mind and spend 72 hours wondering if I'd actually seen what I'd seen. So I went back to the bathroom. I made sure the house was empty. I made sure it was evening, roughly the same time as before, that soft hour when the light is neither bright nor dark. I closed the door behind me and waited for my eyes to adjust. Then I wiped the mirror clean. The hallway was still there, and this time I was prepared to look more carefully. The mirror was cleaner than I'd ever seen it. The steam from hot water had cleared away months of accumulated dust, toothpaste spray, and the invisible film that bathroom mirrors accumulate without you really noticing it's happening. Now, the glass was almost reflective in the way mirrors are supposed to be. Not this one, though. This one still showed the hallway. The hallway was sharper now, more defined. I could see the texture of the walls more clearly, that fungal, waterlogged color I'd identified before. It wasn't green and it wasn't brown. It was something in between, something that looked like it had been exposed to moisture for a very long time. The slide-open door was still there, still in the same position, still revealing nothing of what lay beyond it. But the light was different. It was softer tonight, warmer almost like candlelight, or the last minutes before sunset. It made me think of safety, which was an unsettling thing to feel while looking at something impossible. I raised my hand to the glass again. I was calmer this time, more methodical. This wasn't panic or exhaustion or the permeable space between dreaming and waking. This was deliberate. I pressed my palm flat against the mirror and waited to feel that warmth again. It came quickly, almost immediately, as though the glass had been waiting for me to touch it. The warmth spread up through my hand into my wrist, moving slowly enough that I could track its progress. I closed my eyes and let it happen. When I opened them again, the hallway had changed. The door was more open now, not wide, still just a crack, still revealing only darkness, but wider than it had been. A few more inches of the jamb were visible. The wall seemed to recede slightly deeper into the distance, and the light, that sourceless light, had become slightly brighter, the way a room gets brighter as your eyes adjust to darkness. I pulled my hand away. The warmth stopped immediately, but not abruptly. It faded in the way that heat fades, dissipating from my palm back into the glass. My hand was tingling slightly. My pulse was steady, though, controlled. This was happening, and I was handling it with a kind of rational curiosity that surprised me about myself. I didn't touch the mirror again that night. I cleaned my teeth, washed my face with cold water, and went back to my bedroom. I lay awake again, but differently than before. Before, there had been anxiety. Now there was something closer to anticipation, a question I wanted answered. The next morning, my apartment looked exactly as it always did. This was somehow disappointing. I went to work. I sat at my desk in the quiet office and tried to concentrate on emails and spreadsheets and all the small, necessary tasks that fill a day when you work in administration. My coworker Casey stopped by at one point and asked if I was feeling all right. I must have looked strange. I assured him I was fine. He gave me the look people give you when they know you're lying, but have decided it's not worth pushing. He left me alone after that. I spent the afternoon thinking about my hallway. Not the impossible hallway in the mirror, my hallway. The one in my apartment. The one that led from my bedroom to the living room, a narrow corridor with 3 doors, bathroom, bedroom, closet. I'd walked down it hundreds of times. I knew it. It was one of the most familiar spaces in my life, the kind of place your feet could navigate in complete darkness. And yet, it had never felt as narrow as it felt that afternoon when I came home from work and walked down it toward my bedroom. The wall seemed to press in slightly. The light was different. The geometry felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate. It was as though the walls were at angles that didn't quite match my memory of them. Not dramatically, just slightly off. Just enough to feel it in the back of your skull, in that part of your brain that tracks spatial relationships. I stopped halfway down the hallway and measured the distance to the walls with my eyes. They looked normal. Perfectly normal. The distance on the left was the same as always. The distance on the right was the same as always. The length of the hallway was exactly as long as it had ever been. And yet something about the space felt compressed. Narrower, longer, I kept walking. I forced myself to keep walking until I reached my bedroom door, and then I told myself I was being ridiculous. This was my apartment. I'd lived here for 4 years. The hallway was fine. Everything was fine. But I measured it that evening, just to be sure. With a tape measure from my kitchen drawer, I measured the width of the hallway at 3 different points. The entrance from the living room, the middle section, and the section nearest my bedroom. The numbers were consistent. 3 feet 6 inches every time. The same measurement I'd always known, the same distance I'd walked 1,000 times. There was nothing wrong with the hallway, and yet something had changed. I didn't go back to the bathroom mirror that night. I wasn't avoiding it. I was simply giving myself time. Preparing, there was a quality to what was happening that suggested patience. The hallway in the mirror was opening inch by inch. I didn't know what would happen when it opened fully, and I found that I wanted to be ready for that moment. Not prepared in any practical sense, there was nothing practical to prepare for, but ready in my mind. Calm, present, I slept reasonably well that night, which surprised me. On Thursday morning, I noticed that my apartment was quieter than usual. This is the kind of thing that's difficult to describe without sounding absurd. My apartment is always quiet. It's in a well-maintained building in a residential neighborhood. The insulation is good. There are no immediate neighbors, no loud traffic, no obvious sources of noise. But there's always a baseline of quiet. The kind of ambient sound that you don't consciously register, but that your ears pick up anyway. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the building settling, the distant sounds of the city outside the windows, the white noise of ordinary life happening around you. That morning, none of that was there. The silence was complete. Total. When I turned on the coffee maker, the sound it made was startling in a way that ordinary sounds shouldn't be. When I opened the refrigerator, the mechanical hum of its compressor seemed abnormally loud. My footsteps on the kitchen tile echoed slightly. I opened the windows. The city outside was functioning normally. I could see cars moving on the street below, people walking past the building, the ordinary business of morning in the neighborhood. But no sound reached me. It was as though there was a barrier between my apartment and the rest of the world. A soundproof seal. Something that was letting light in, but not sound. I closed the windows again. The silence remained. This would have been terrifying if I hadn't still been in that calm, curious state. Instead, I noted it. I made a mental note of it. I observed it the way I might observe anything unusual in the world around me. The way you notice that the light is different on a cloudy day, or that traffic is heavier than usual. It was odd. It was noteworthy. It was not in itself frightening. I went about my day. I worked from home, sending emails to clients, reviewing reports, doing all the quiet work of my quiet job. The silence never changed. It was perfect and complete, and by noon I had almost gotten used to it. Almost. By evening, the silence had lifted. The sounds of the building, the city, the world returned gradually, as though a door was being slowly opened. By the time the sun was setting, everything sounded normal again. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear cars outside. I could hear the small, necessary sounds of a building full of people living their lives. I ordered dinner. I ate it. I watched television for an hour without really taking in what was happening on screen. And then, as the evening deepened into that soft hour that I'd come to recognize, I went back to the bathroom. The mirror showed the hallway exactly as I expected it to. The door was more open now, perhaps 6 inches, maybe 7. I could see a bit more of the frame around it and a thin slice of the darkness beyond. The walls of the hallway seemed to recede further into distance. The light was brighter. It had warmed from that candlelight quality to something more like a room at dusk, that golden hour when day is transitioning into evening, when things are still visible, but the light is becoming unreliable. I didn't touch the mirror this time. I simply looked at it. After a few minutes, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was something on the floor of the hallway, something small, positioned just in front of the slightly open door. I leaned closer to the mirror, trying to make out what it was. A shape, rectangular, something that caught the light in a way that suggested it was metallic or glass. It looked like a key. My breath caught slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, in understanding that this was moving forward, that the process was accelerating, that I was being invited further into whatever this was, and that the invitation was becoming more explicit. I pulled away from the mirror and sat on the edge of the bathtub. My hands were steady, my heartbeat was normal. But I was aware of a shift in myself, a movement from simple curiosity into something more deliberate. This wasn't just observation anymore, this was participation. I was no longer simply looking at something impossible. I was engaging with it, responding to it, moving toward some kind of answer that I didn't yet understand, but that I could feel approaching. I washed my hands. I washed my face. I turned off the light and closed the bathroom door behind me. But I didn't go back to bed. Instead, I walked to my hallway and stood in it, looking down its length toward my bedroom door. The hallway was exactly as it had always been. 3 feet 6 inches wide, exactly 12 feet long, I now knew, because I'd measured it. Normal geometry, normal light, normal walls. But standing in it now felt different. It felt like standing in a hallway that existed in 2 places at once. Friday passed strangely. I called in sick to work, which was unusual for me. I rarely took sick days. I had no legitimate illness to claim. But I needed to be home. I needed to be in my apartment with the door closed and the silence and the careful observation of things that were beginning to change. The hallway continued to feel wrong throughout the day. Each time I walked down it, to get coffee, to get lunch, to move from one room to another, it felt slightly different, slightly longer, slightly narrower, slightly further away from what I remembered it being. By afternoon, I was beginning to wonder if I'd ever actually measured it correctly. Maybe I'd made a mistake. Maybe it had always been this long, this narrow, and I was simply noticing it for the first time. I measured it again with the same tape measure from the kitchen drawer. 3 feet 6 inches, exactly as before. That evening, I made myself wait until the soft hour. I made myself eat dinner. I made myself sit through the transitional time between day and evening with patience, when what I wanted was to run to the bathroom and look at the mirror and see how much further the door had opened. But patience seemed important. It seemed like the hallway and the mirror was on a schedule, and that schedule was something I needed to respect. When evening finally came, I went to the bathroom and closed the door. The hallway had progressed exactly as I expected it to. The door was open perhaps 10 inches now. The darkness beyond had begun to resolve into shapes. The walls seemed much further away. The golden light had deepened slightly, becoming more amber, more reminiscent of lamplight than of dusk. And the key was closer to the mirror now. It had moved. It was no longer positioned in front of the door, but was lying on the floor of the hallway, directly in my line of sight, impossible to miss. It was brass I could see now. Old brass. The kind of key that opens old doors. The kind of key that suggests history, mystery, something locked away a long time ago. I reached toward the mirror. I didn't touch it. I simply raised my hand and held it near the glass, my fingers spread slightly, as though I was reaching toward something across a distance. The warmth came immediately. It came through the glass and into my palm, and it was stronger now than it had been before. Not painful, but intense. It spread up through my wrist and into my arm, and I realized that I could feel texture through the glass. The hallway was somehow becoming tactile. I could feel the temperature of its walls, the texture of its flooring, the quality of its air. I pulled my hand back and the sensation stopped. I sat on the bathroom floor for a very long time after that, my back against the wall, trying to process what was happening, trying to understand what was being asked of me. The answer seemed clear in its outlines, even if I didn't want to articulate it to myself. The hallway in the mirror was opening for a reason. The door was opening for a reason. The key was there for a reason. And at some point, maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, I was going to be expected to reach through the glass and pick it up. And then I was going to have to use it to unlock whatever lay on the other side of that door. The thought didn't frighten me. It should have. But all I felt was that same calm, curious anticipation. That sense of moving toward something inevitable. That certainty that there was an answer waiting for me in that hallway, and that I had been meant to find it all along. I turned off the bathroom light and went to bed. Tomorrow, I thought, would require preparation, but I didn't know what kind. The following morning, I woke certain that I had made a decision in sleep, not consciously, not in any part of myself I could interrogate. But the certainty was there, settled in my chest like a weight, and with it came a strange clarity about what needed to happen next. I went through my day as though performing a role I'd rehearsed. Work from my desk in the spare room. Conference call at 10 that I barely heard. lunch that tasted like nothing. The hours moved with that particular slowness they take on when you're waiting for something, when every minute feels longer than it should. But underneath it all was the knowledge of what sat behind the bathroom door, the hallway, the advancing door, the key lying in wait on that amber-lit floor. By afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in my bedroom, not the bathroom mirror, but the smaller one on my dresser. I looked at my reflection and tried to recognize myself. The person looking back seemed patient, expectant, like someone who had already begun a journey and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. I went downstairs and made coffee, though I didn't drink it. I made myself move through the house, touching things. The couch, the kitchen counter, the spine of a book on the shelf. I was testing them, I realized. Testing their solidity. Testing whether anything in this space was still entirely real. Everything felt thinner than I remembered. Everything had the quality of something almost transparent. By early evening, I was standing in front of the bathroom door. I hadn't intended to go there. I'd been sitting in the living room, not thinking about anything in particular, and the next thing I was aware of, I was here. My hand was on the doorknob. The hallway beyond was calling. I opened the door slowly. The mirror showed me the hallway as I had known it would. The door was open perhaps 18 inches now. The darkness beyond had resolved fully into definition. I could see the pattern of the floorboards. I could see the texture of the walls. They were papered in something old, something with a faded floral pattern, the kind of wallpaper that wouldn't be chosen in this decade or the last one. Something from 40 years ago, perhaps. 50, the key was still on the floor, but it had moved again. It was no longer in the middle of the hallway, but positioned directly in front of the door itself, as though placed there deliberately, as though set out specifically for me. What was different was the light. The golden amber glow had deepened into something richer, something almost like firelight. And there was something else, a sound. Not a sound I could quite hear, but a sense of sound, a resonance, like something distant, like something calling from very far away. I placed my hand against the glass. The warmth came immediately, but it was different this time. It wasn't warmth that came from beyond the glass. It came from within it. The mirror itself was warm. The surface was becoming soft. I could feel the give in it, the way glass might feel if it had been heated and was beginning to lose its rigid shape. I pressed my palm flat against the surface. My hand sank into the mirror to the wrist. I didn't pull back. I couldn't pull back. The sensation was extraordinary, not painful, but consuming. My hand was in the hallway. I could feel the floorboards beneath my fingertips. I could feel the texture of the air. And I could feel something else, a presence, something that had been waiting for me to do this, something that had been arranging everything with infinite patience. I withdrew my hand slowly. The mirror was solid again. No marks, no evidence that anything had changed. But my hand was dry from the air of that hallway, and my fingers smelled of old wood and old paper. The smell of the wallpaper, the smell of preserved time. I sat down on the bathroom floor and made myself think clearly. This was no longer something I could avoid or dismiss. This was no longer a trick of light or a shift in perception. The mirror was a door. The hallway was real. And it was not a place that existed elsewhere in this house. It was not a room I had forgotten. It was not a hallway I had simply never noticed before. It was something other, and I had been invited into it. The question was no longer whether I would go through. The question was when. I got to my feet and looked at the mirror again. The door was open wider now, perhaps 20 inches. The key lay glinting on the floorboards, and the light had grown steadier, more deliberate. Not the light of a room with curtains and windows, the light of a place that generated its own illumination, a place that didn't require the sun. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed and listened to the house around me. I listened to the walls settle. I listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I listened to the small sounds of a house occupied by one person who was becoming increasingly uncertain of what was happening inside it. Sometime after 3 in the morning, I heard a sound from the bathroom. Not loud, not violent, just a single sound. A soft click, the way a door sounds when it closes very gently. Someone closing it from the inside. Someone within that hallway closing the door that led to my bathroom. I didn't get up. I didn't turn on the light. I lay there in the dark and felt something settle in me. The sense that whatever this was, whatever had been opening itself to me through the mirror, had now finished its invitation. The door was still open from my side, but something had closed on the other side. Some boundary had been marked. This was the moment of choosing. This was the threshold. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I spent most of the day preparing, though I'm not sure what preparation actually meant. I showered. I ate. I packed nothing, because there was nothing to pack for. I arranged things in the house, books, glasses, the few plates in the sink. I wanted the place to look intentional, deliberate, like someone who had made a choice and meant for that choice to be understood. By evening, I was standing in front of the mirror again. The hallway was brighter now. The door was open perhaps 30 inches. And something had changed about the space. It had become more dimensional. I could see depth in ways I hadn't before. The hallway extended back further than it should have, much further. The walls were high. The ceiling was a deep shadow. And somewhere in that darkness, behind that door that stood open in invitation, was the place I was meant to go. The key was no longer on the floor. I realized this with a shock